Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable persistence of medieval mysteries. Stories once dismissed as legend, conspiracy, or drunken monk exaggeration now unraveling under the cold, quiet gaze of modern science. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Legends of the Bastille. Chapter I. The Bastille, wrote Saint Foix, is a castle which, without being strong, is one of the most formidable in Europe, and about it I shall say nothing. Silence is safer than speech on that subject, was the saying in Paris. At the extremity of the Rue Saint-Anne, as one entered the suburb, appeared the 8 lofty towers, somber, massive, plunging their moss-grown feet into pools of muddy water. Their walls were pierced at intervals with narrow, iron-barred windows. They were crowned with battlements. Situated not far from the Marais, the blithe and wealthy quarter, and quite near to the suburb Saint-Anne, where industry raised its perpetual hum, the Bastille, charged with gloom and silence, formed an impressive contrast. The common impression it made is conveyed by Restif de la Bretonne in his Nights of Paris. It was a nightmare, that awesome Bastille, on which, as I passed each evening along the Rue Saint-Gilles, I never dared to turn my eyes. The towers had an air of mystery, harsh and melancholy, and the royal government threw mystery like a cloud around them. At nightfall, when the shutters were closed, a cab would cross the drawbridge, and from time to time, in the blackness of night, funeral processions, vague shadows which the light of a torch set flickering on the walls, would make their silent exit. How many of those who had entered there had ever been seen again? And if perchance one met a former prisoner, to the first question he would reply that on leaving he had signed a promise to reveal nothing of what he had seen. This former prisoner had, as a matter of fact, never seen anything to speak of. Absolute silence was imposed upon the warders. There is no exchanging of confidences in this place, writes Madame de Staël, and the people you come across have all such freezing physiognomies that you would think twice before asking the most trifling question. The first article of their code, says Linked, is the impenetrable mystery which envelops all their operations. We know how legends are formed. Sometimes you see them open out like flowers brilliant under the sun's bright beams. You see them blossom under the glorious radiance that lights up the life of heroes. The man himself has long gone down into the tomb. The legend survives. It streams across the ages like a meteor leaving its trail of light. It grows, broadens out with ever-increasing luster and glow. In this light we see Themistocles, Leonidas, Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne, Napoleon. Or maybe, on the contrary, the legend is born in some remote corner, covered with shade and silence. Their men have lived their lives there, it has been their lot to suffer. Their moans have risen in solitude and confinement, and the only ears that heard them were harder than their stone walls. These moans, heard by no compassionate soul, the great resounding soul of the people catches up, swelling them with all its might. Soon, among the mass of the people, there passes a blast irresistible in its strength, like the tempest that upheaves the restless waves. Then is the sea loosed from its chains, the tumultuous breakers dash upon the affrighted shore, the sea walls are all swept away. In a letter written by Chevalier, the major of the Bastille, to Sartine, the chief of the police, he spoke of the common gossip on the Bastille that was going about. Although utterly false, he said, I think it very dangerous on account of its dissemination through the kingdom, and that has now been going on for several years. No attention was paid to Chevalier's warning. Mystery continued to be the rule at the Bastille and in all that related to it. The mildness of manners and of the government, writes La Harpe, had caused needlessly harsh measures in great part to disappear. They lived on in the imagination of the people, augmented and strengthened by the tales which credulity and hate seize upon. Ere long the memoirs of Ladude and of Linked appeared. Ladude concealed his grievous faults to paint his long sufferings in strokes of fire. Linked with his rare literary talent, made of the Bastille a picture dark in the extreme, compressing the gist of his pamphlet into the sentence. Except perhaps in hell there are no tortures to approach those of the Bastille. At the same period, the great Mirabeau was launching his powerful plea against letters de cachet, arbitrary orders. These books produced a mighty reverberation. The revolution broke out like a clap of thunder. The Bastille was disemboweled. The frowning towers crumbled stone by stone under the picks of the demolishers, and as if they had been the pedestal of the ancient regime, that too toppled over with a crash. One of the halls of the Bastille contained, in boxes carefully arranged, the entire history of the celebrated fortress from the year 1659, at which date the foundation of this precious store of archives had been begun. There were collected the documents concerning, not only the prisoners of the Bastille, but all the persons who had been lodged there, either under sentence of exile or simply arrested within the limits of the Generality of Paris in virtue of a letter de cachet. The documents in this storeroom had been in charge of archivists, who throughout the 18th century had labored with zeal and intelligence at putting in order papers which, on the eve of the Revolution, were counted by hundreds of thousands. The whole mass was now in perfect order, classified and docketed. The major of the Château, Chevalier, had even been commissioned to make these documents the basis of a history of the prisoners. The Bastille was taken. In the disorder, what was the fate of the archives? The ransacking of the papers continued for 2 days, writes Dussaulx, one of the commissioners elected by the Assembly for the preservation of the archives of the Bastille. When on Thursday the 16th my colleagues and myself went down into the sort of cellar where the archives were, we found the boxes in very orderly arrangement on the shelves, but they were already empty. The most important documents had been carried off, the rest were strewn on the floor, scattered about the courtyard, and even in the moats. However, the curious still found some gleanings there. The testimony of Dussaulx is only too well confirmed. I went to see the siege of the Bastille, writes Restif de la Bretonne. When I arrived it was all over, the place was taken. Infuriated men were throwing papers, documents of great historical value from the top of the towers into the moats. Among these papers, some had been burnt, some torn, registers had been torn to shreds and trailed in the mud. The mob had invaded the halls of the Château. Men of learning and mere curiosity hunters strove eagerly to get possession of as many of these documents as possible, in which they thought they were sure to find startling revelations. There is talk of the son of a celebrated magistrate, writes Gabriel Brizard, who went off with his carriage full of them. Villeneuve, then 27 years of age and already a collector, gathered a rich harvest for his study, and Beaumarchais, in the course of a patriotic ramble through the interior of the captured fortress, was careful to get together a certain number of these papers. The papers purloined from the archives on the day of the capture and the day following became dispersed throughout France and Europe. A large packet came into the hands of Pierre Labrowski, an attaché in the Russian embassy. Sold in 1805 with his whole collection to the Emperor Alexander, the papers were deposited in the Hermitage Palace. Today they are preserved in the Imperial Library at St. Petersburg. Fortunately, the custody of the captured fortress was entrusted on July 15 to the Company of Arquebusiers, which received orders to prevent the removal of any more papers. On July 16, one of the members present at a sitting of the Electoral Assembly sprang forward to the table and cried, "Ah, gentlemen, let us save the papers. It is said that the papers of the Bastille are being plundered. Let us hasten to collect the remnants of these old title deeds of an intolerable despotism, so that we may inspire our latest posterity with their horror." There was rapturous applause. A committee was nominated consisting of Dussaulx, de Champsaurou, Gournot, and Calo. Let us follow the style of the period. Before the Bastille, the commissioners received a triumphant reception. Amid the cheers of the people, who had been informed of their mission, 10 distinguished men of letters besought them to lead the commissioners into the heart of that famous fortress so long detested. When they got into the Bastille, the commissioners were not long in perceiving that they were a little behind the fair. Many boxes were empty, and there was an immense heap of papers in complete disorder. The question of the papers of the Bastille grew day by day extraordinarily popular. The Electoral Assembly had just appointed commissioners to collect them. Lafayette, commander of the National Guards, imposed a similar duty on the St. Elizabeth district. Bailly, the mayor of Paris, delegated Dussaulx to the same office. In the Constituent Assembly, the Comte de Châtenay proposed that the municipality of Paris should be instructed to get together the papers found at the Bastille, so that they might be arranged and that extracts from them might be printed and published, in order to keep forever alive in the hearts of Frenchmen, by means of this reading, the detestation of arbitrary orders and the love of liberty. This book was to be the preface to the Constitution. Finally, the district of Saint-Roch took the initiative in calling upon the electors to restore to the nation the papers carried off from the Bastille by Beaumarchais. In the sitting of July 24, the Electoral Assembly passed a resolution enjoining such citizens as were in possession of papers from the Bastille to bring them back to the Hôtel de Ville. The appeal was responded to, and the restitutions were numerous. When the pillage and destruction had been stopped, and possession had been regained of a part of the stolen documents, the papers were consigned to 3 different depositories, but it was not long before they were deposited all together in the convent of St. Louis-la-Culture. At length, on November 2, 1791, the Commune of Paris resolved to have the precious documents placed in the city library. The decision was so much the more happy in that the transfer, while placing the papers under the guardianship of trained men and genuine librarians, did not necessitate removal, since the city library at that date occupied the same quarters as the archives of the Bastille, namely, the convent of St. Louis-la-Culture. To the revolutionary period succeeded times of greater calm. The archives of the Bastille, after being the object of so much discussion, and having occupied the Constituent Assembly, the Electoral Assembly, the Paris Commune, the Press, Mirabeau, Lafayette, Bailly, all Paris, the whole of France, fell into absolute oblivion. They were lost from sight, the very recollection of them was effaced. In 1840, a young librarian named François Ravaisin discovered them in the Arsenal Library at the bottom of a veritable dungeon. How had they got stranded there? Amelhin, the city librarian, had been elected on April 22, 1797, keeper of the Arsenal Library. Anxious to enrich the new depository of which he had become the head, he obtained a decree handing over the papers of the Bastille to the Arsenal Library. The librarians recoiled in dismay before this invasion of documents, more than 600,000 in number and in the most admired disorder. Then, having put their heads together, they had the papers crammed into a dusty back room, putting off the sorting of them from day to day. 40 years slipped away, and if it happened that some old antiquary, curious and importunate, asked to be allowed to consult the documents he had heard spoken of in his youth, he was answered, no doubt in perfect good faith, that they did not know what he was talking about. In 1840, François Ravaisin had to get some repairs done in his kitchen at the Arsenal Library. The slabs of the flooring were raised when there came to view in the yawning hole a mass of old papers. It happened by the merest chance that, as he drew a leaf out of the heap, Ravaisin laid his hand on a letter de cachet. He understood at once that he had just discovered the lost treasure. 50 years of laborious effort have now restored the order which the victors of the 14th of July and successive removals had destroyed. The archives of the Bastille still constitute, at the present day, an imposing collection in spite of the gaps made by fire and pillage in 1789, forever to be regretted. The administration of the Arsenal Library has acquired copies of the documents coming from the Bastille which are preserved at St. Petersburg. The archives of the Bastille are now open to inspection by any visitor to the Arsenal Library in rooms specially fitted up for them. Several registers had holes burnt in them on the day of the capture of the Bastille. Their binding is scorched black, their leaves are yellow. In the boxes, the documents are now numbered and they are daily consulted by men of letters. The catalogue has been compiled and published recently through the assiduity of the Minister of Public Instruction. It is by the light of these documents, of undeniable genuineness and authority, that the black shade which so long brooded over the Bastille has at length been dispelled. The legends have melted away in the clear light of history, as the thick cloak of mist with which night covers the earth is dissipated by the morning sun, and enigmas which mankind, wearied of fruitless investigations, had resigned itself to declare insoluble, have now at last been solved. Chapter II. History of the Bastille. Julius Caesar describes a structure 3 stories high which his legionaries used rapidly to erect in front of towns they were besieging. Such was the remote origin of the Bastides or Bastilles, as these movable fortresses were called in the Middle Ages. Froissart, speaking of a place that was being invested, says that Bastides were stationed on the roads and in the open country in such a manner that the town could get no food supplies. It was not long before the designation was applied to the fixed towers erected on the ramparts for the defense of the towns, and more particularly to those which were constructed at the entrance gates. In 1356, the chroniclers mention some important works that had been done on the circumvallations of Paris. These were constructions interrupting the wall at intervals, and so placed as to protect either an entrance gate or the wall itself. The special designations of échafauds, guillerites, or barbicanes were applied to such of these buildings as rose between 2 gates of the city, while the Bastilles or Bastides were those which defended the gates. The first stone of the edifice, which for more than 4 centuries was to remain famous under the name of the Bastille, was laid on April 22, 1370, by the mayor of Paris in person, Hugh Aubriot, the object being to strengthen the defenses of the city against the English. To reproach the king, Charles V, with the construction of a cruel prison would be almost as reasonable as to reproach Louis Philippe with the construction of the fortress of Mont Valérien. We borrow these details from M. Fernand Bournon's excellent work on the Bastille in the Histoire générale de Paris. The Bastille, writes M. Bournon, at the time of its capture on July 14, 1789, was still identical, except in some trifling particulars, with the work of the architects of the 14th century. The Place de la Bastille of the present day does not correspond exactly to the site of the fortress. Mentally, to restore that site, it is necessary to take away the last houses of the Rue Saint-Anne and the Boulevard Henry IV. The ground they occupy was then covered with the Château and its glacis. The round towers, however, must have extended considerably in advance of the line of the houses and have encroached upon the pavement. The plan reproducing the site exactly is today marked by lines of white stones, by means of which all Parisians may get some notion of it if they go to the Place de la Bastille. M. Auguet de Lachaux, who drew so largely upon the works of M. Bournon and ourselves for his lecture on the Bastille, will permit us in our turn to borrow from him the description he gave of the Bastille, so far as its construction is concerned. Prints of the commonest kind which have circulated in thousands, the more recent reconstruction which in 1889 gave Paris so much entertainment, have familiarized us with the aspect of the Bastille, whose 8 circular towers, connected by curtains of equal height, give us the impression of a box all of a piece, or if you prefer it, an enormous sarcophagus. The 8 towers all had their names. There were the corner, the chapel, and the well towers, names readily accounted for by their position or by details of their construction. Then came the Berdadière and Bazinière towers, baptized by the names of 2 former prisoners. The Treasure Tower was so called because it had received on many occasions, notably under Henry IV, the custody of the public money. The excellent poet Mathurin Regnier alludes to this fact in these oft-quoted lines. Now mark these parsons, sons of ill-got gain, whose grasping sires for years have stolen amain, whose family coffers vaster wealth conceal. Then fills that royal storehouse the Bastille. The 7th tower was known as the County Tower, owing its name as M. born on conjectures to the feudal dignity called the County of Paris. The hypothesis, he adds, derives the greater weight from the fact that the mayors of Paris were called, up to the end of the ancient regime, mayors of the town and viscounty of Paris. The eighth tower bore a name which for the tower of a prison is very remarkable. It was called the Tower of Liberty. This odd appellation had come to it from the circumstance that it had been the part of the Bastille where prisoners were lodged who enjoyed exceptionally favorable treatment, those who had the liberty of walking during the day in the courtyards of the Chateau. These prisoners were said to be in the liberty of the court. The officers of the Chateau called them the prisoners of the liberty in contradistinction to the prisoners in durance, and that one of the 8 towers in which they were lodged was thus, quite naturally, called the Tower of Liberty. The towers of the chapel and the treasure, which were the oldest, had flanked the original gateway, but this was soon walled up, leaving however in the masonry the outline of its arch, and even the statues of saints and crowned princes that had been the only ornaments of its bare walls. In accordance with custom, says M. Auguet de Lachaux, the entrance to the Bastille was single and double at the same time. The gate for vehicles defended by its drawbridge was flanked by a smaller gate reserved for foot passengers, and this, too, was only accessible when a small drawbridge was lowered. In the first of the 2 courtyards of the Bastille, D'Argenson had placed a monumental clock held up by large sculptured figures representing prisoners in chains. The heavy chains fell in graceful curves around the clock face as a kind of ornamentation. D'Argenson and his artists had a ferocious taste. On the morrow of the defeat at Saint-Quentin, the fear of invasion decided Henry II, under the advice of Coligny, to strengthen the Bastille. It was then, accordingly, that there was constructed, in front of the Saint-Quentin gate, the bastion which was at a later date to be adorned with a garden for the prisoners to walk in. Around the massive and forbidding prison, in the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, quite a little town sprang up and flourished. As in the Middle Ages happened around lofty and impressive cathedrals, barbers, cobblers, drink sellers, poulterers, cheesemongers, and general dealers had their shops there. These new buildings encroached on the Rue Saint-Antoine and extended as far as the Convent of the Visitation, the chapel of which, converted into a Protestant place of worship, still exists. In its latter days, writes M. de Lachaux, the Bastille with its appendages presented an appearance somewhat as follows. On the Rue Saint-Antoine, a gateway of considerable size and with its trophies of arms making some pretensions to a triumphal arch, gave access to a first court skirted with shops and open, at least during the day, to all comers. People might pass through it freely, but were not allowed to loiter there. Then appeared a second entrance, a double one for horse and foot traffic, each gate defended by its drawbridge. Admittance through this was more difficult and the sentry's instructions more rigorous. This was the outer guard. As soon as this entrance was passed, one came to the court of the governor, who received the more or less voluntary visitor. On the right stretched the quarters of the governor and his staff, contiguous to the armory. Then there were the moats, originally supplied by the waters of the Seine. At that time people frequently fell in and were drowned, the moats not being protected by any railing. In later times they were for the most part dry. Then rose the lofty towers of the citadel, encircled nearly 100 feet up by their crown of battlements. And then one found the last drawbridge, most often raised at any rate before the carriage gate, the door for foot passengers alone remaining accessible under still more rigorous conditions. These conditions, so rigorous for contemporaries, the Tsar Peter the Great himself found them inflexible, are removed for the historian. Thanks to the numerous memoirs left by prisoners, thanks to the documents relating to the administration of the Bastille now in the Arsenal Library, and to the correspondence of the lieutenants of police, we shall penetrate into the interior of these well-fenced precincts and follow the life of the prisoners day by day. In its early days, then, the Bastille was not a prison, though it became such as early as the reign of Charles VI. Yet for 2 centuries it kept its character as a military citadel. Sometimes the kings gave lodgment there to great personages who were passing through Paris. Louis XI and Francis I held brilliant fêtes there, of which the chroniclers speak with admiration. It is Richelieu who must be considered the founder of the Bastille. The Bastille, that is, as a royal prison, the Bastille of the 17th and 18th centuries. Before him, imprisonment in the old fortress was merely casual. It is to him that we must trace the conception of the state prison as an instrument of government. Here we shall be arrested by the question, what is to be understood by a state prison? The term, vague and open to discussion, is explained by M. Bournon. By a state prison, taking the Bastille as a particular instance, must be understood a prison for those who have committed a crime or misdemeanor not provided for by the common law, for those who rightly or wrongly have appeared dangerous to the safety of the state, whether the nation itself is concerned or its head, or a body more or less considerable of citizens, a body sometimes no larger than the family of the suspect. If we add to this class of prisoners personages too conspicuous to be punished for a crime at common law on equal terms with the ordinary malefactor, and for whom it would appear inevitable that an exceptional prison should be reserved, we shall have passed in review the different kinds of delinquents who expiated their misdeeds at the Bastille from the time of Richelieu to the Revolution. The administration of the Bastille, which up to the reign of Louis XIII, was entrusted to great lords, dukes, constables, marshals of France, the Marshal de Bassompierre, the Constable de Lines, the Marshal de Vitry, the Duke of Luxembourg, to mention only the last of them, was placed by Richelieu in the hands of a real jailer, Leclerc du Tremblay, brother of Pierre Joseph. Documents throwing any light on the Bastille at the time when the Red Man, as Victor Hugo named Richelieu, was supreme, are however very rare. An advocate, Matin de la Varenne, published in 1786 in his Revolutions of Paris, a letter which ostensibly had been written on December 1, 1642, to Richelieu, at that time ill. In it we read, "I whom you are causing to rot in the Bastille for having disobeyed your commandment, which would have brought upon my soul condemnation to eternal hell, and would have made me appear in eternity with hands stained with blood. It is impossible to guarantee the authenticity of this document. To us it appears suspicious, the text having been published at a time when many apocryphal documents were produced as coming from the archives of the Bastille. More worthy of arresting our attention is the return of the prisoners who are in the shadow of the Bastille, a document of Richelieu's time which M. Bournon discovered in the archives of the Foreign Office. This catalogue, containing 53 names, is the oldest list of prisoners of the Bastille known up to the present time. Among the prisoners, several are suspected or convicted of evil designs against Monsieur le Cardinal. Some are accused of an intention to complot, that is, to conspire against the throne, or of being spies. There is an extravagant priest, a monk who had opposed Cluny's election, 3 hermits, 3 coiners, the Marquis de Signy, condemned to death, but whose punishment had been commuted to perpetual imprisonment, a score or so of lords designated as madmen, vile scoundrels, evil wretches, or accused of some definite crime, theft, or murder. Finally, those whose name is followed by the simple note, Queen Mother or Monsieur, whence we may conclude that the clerk had no exact information about the prisoners of the cardinal. We shall give later the list of the prisoners in the Bastille on the day of its capture, July 14, 1789, and the comparison between the 2 lists at the 2 periods, the remotest and the most recent that we could select, will be instructive. We have also, to assist us in forming a judgment of the Bastille in Richelieu's time, the memoirs of Bassompierre and of Laporte, which transport us into a state prison elegant, We might almost say luxurious, reserved for prisoners of birth and breeding, where they lived observing all social usages in their mutual relations, paying and returning calls. But the Bastille preserved its military character for many more years, and among the prisoners we find especially a number of officers punished for breaches of discipline. Prisoners of war were confined there, and foreign personages of high rank arrested by way of reprisal, secret agents and spies employed in France by hostile nations, finally, powerful lords who had incurred the king's displeasure. The court intrigues under Richelieu and Mazarin contributed to the diversion of the Bastille from its original intention. They began to incarcerate their valets de chambre who had somehow become mixed up in the plots of sovereigns. Religious persecution was revived by the government of Louis XIV, and ere long a whole world of gazetteers and novelists, the journalists of the period, were seen swarming like flies in the sun. Louis XIV was not precisely a stickler for the liberty of the press, but on the other hand he shrank from cooping up men of letters, Jansenists and Protestants convinced of the truth of their beliefs, pell-mell with the vagabonds and thieves confined at Bicarter, Saint-Lazare, and the other prisons of Paris. He threw open to them, too generously no doubt, the portals of his Chateau in the suburb Saint-Anton, where they mixed with young men of family undergoing a mild course of the Bastille at the request of their parents, and with quarrelsome nobles whom the marshals of France, anxious to avoid duels, used to send there to forget their animosities. Further, the reign of Louis XIV was marked by some great trials which produced a strange and appalling impression, and threw around the accused a halo of mystery, trials for magic and sorcery, cases of poisoning and base coining. The accused parties in these cases were confined in the Bastille, and here we encounter a fresh departure from the primitive character of the old fortress. Prisoners were sent there whose cases were tried by the regularly constituted judges. Henceforth prisoners who appeared before the court of the Arsenal were divided between the Bastille and the fortress of Vincennes. This is the grand epoch in the history of the Bastille. It is now a veritable prison of state. Writers can speak of its nobleness. It shows itself to us in colors at once charming and awe-inspiring, brilliant, majestic, now filled with sounds of merriment, now veiled with an appalling silence. From the gloomy regions within the massive walls there come to us the sounds of song and laughter mingled with cries of despair, with sobs and tears. This is the period of the Iron Mask, the period when the governor receives mysterious letters from the court. I beg you, sir, to see that, if anyone comes to ask for news of the prisoner whom Descrez conducted to the Bastille this morning by order of the king, nothing be said about him, and that, if possible, in accordance with the intention of His Majesty and the accompanying instructions, no one may get to know him or even his name. M. de Berneville, the name of one of the governors of the Bastille, having given orders for the conveyance of an important prisoner to the prison of my Chateau of the Bastille, I send this letter to inform you of my intention that you receive him there and keep him closely guarded until further orders, warning you not to permit him, under any pretext whatever, to hold communication with any person, either by word of mouth or in writing. The prisoners, surrounded with so absolute a silence, almost all belonged to the same category, namely distinguished spies, who seem to have been rather numerous in France at the full tide of Louis XIV's wars, and who were hunted down with an eagerness which grew in proportion as fortune frowned on the royal armies. We read in the journal kept by the king's lieutenant, Du Junca. On Wednesday, December 22, about 10 o'clock in the morning, M. de Lacoste, provost of the king's armies, came here, bringing and leaving in our custody a prisoner whom for greater secrecy he caused to enter by our new gate, which allows us to pass into or out of the garden of the Arsenal at all hours. The which prisoner, M. d'Estingen by name, a German but married in England, was received by the governor by order of the king, sent by the hand of the Marquis de Barbezieux. with explicit instructions to keep the prisoner's presence a secret and to prevent him from holding communication with anyone in speech or writing. The which prisoner is a widower without children, a man of intelligence, and doing a brisk trade in news of what is happening in France, sending his information to Germany, England, and Holland, a gentlemanly spy. On February 10, 1710. Pontchartrain wrote to Bournonville, governor of the Bastille, "I cannot refrain from telling you that you and the Chevalier de la Croix speak a good deal too much and too openly about the foreign prisoners you have. Secrecy and mystery is one of your first duties, as I must ask you to remember. Neither D'Argenson nor any other than those I have apprised you of should see these prisoners. Give explicit warning to the Abbé Renaudot and to de la Croix of the necessity of maintaining an inviolable and impenetrable secrecy." It happened also at that period that a prisoner remained in complete ignorance of the reason of his incarceration. "The prisoner at the Bastille named J.J. Duvaki," writes Louvois to the governor, "has complained to the king that he has been kept there for 13 years without knowing the reason. Be good enough to let me know what minister signed the warrant under which he is detained, so that I may report to his majesty." As the greater part of the papers relating to the arrest were destroyed as soon as the incarceration was effected, it sometimes happened that in certain cases the reasons were not known even in the offices of the ministers. Thus Seignelay writes to the governor M. de Bismuth, "The king has commanded me to write and ask you who is a certain prisoner named Dumisnil, how long he has been at the Bastille, and for what reason he was placed there. Demoiselle de Murrel, a prisoner at the Bastille, having demanded her liberty of the king, his majesty has instructed me to write and ask you the reason of her detention. If you know it, be good enough to inform me at your earliest convenience." Again we find Louvois writing to the same effect. "I am sending you a letter from M. Coquet, in regard to which the king has commanded me to ask who signed the warrant under which he was sent to the Bastille, and whether you know the reason of his being sent there. Sir, I am writing a line merely to ask you to let me know who is Piet de la Fontaine, who has been 5 years at the Bastille, and whether you do not remember why he was placed there. Letters of this kind are, it is true, very rare. Yet if one compares the state of things they disclose with the extraordinary comfort and luxury with which the prisoners were surrounded, they help to characterize the celebrated prison at this epoch of its history, namely, the 17th century. In 1667, the office of Lieutenant of Police had been created. The first to hold the title was Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, a man of the greatest worth. It is very important to note that under the ancient regime the Lieutenant of Police had a double function, being at the same time a subordinate of the Minister of Paris and a member of the Châtelet. His duties were thus of a twofold nature, administrative and judicial. Now the Bastille as a state prison was more especially an administrative institution, but gradually, owing to the character of the persons brought there as prisoners, it became difficult to avoid turning it also into a judicial institution, and the Minister of Paris became accustomed to delegate his subordinate, the Lieutenant of Police, to conduct the examination of the prisoners at the Bastille. Though La Reynie took practically the whole responsibility of the administration of the Bastille, his visits to the prison itself were nevertheless relatively rare, and on every occasion a permit signed by Louis Xiv or by Colbert was necessary. La Reynie was succeeded by D'Argenson. Under him the powers of the Lieutenant of Police were very largely extended, and the Bastille was comprised within his jurisdiction. Henceforth the Lieutenant of Police will enter the state prison whenever it seems good to him, as lord and master, accompanied by his subordinates at the Châtelet, clerks and inspectors of police. The prisoners will be in direct and constant communication with him, and he will make an inspection of all the chambers at least once a year. We find that at every change in the lieutenancy of police, it sufficed for the Minister of Paris to send the name of the new officer to the governor. Dating from this period, the prison in the suburb Saint-Antoine remained under the authority of a magistrate. The The Regency was a transition period between the reigns of Louis XIV and Louis XV, and there was a corresponding transition period in the history of the Bastille. The incarcerations were less numerous and less rigorous, but the rule of the prison lost something of that aristocratic air which had characterized it. The most important episode in the history of the Bastille during the Regency was the incarceration of those who were accused of complicity in the Celomare conspiracy. Among these was Mdile de Launay, later to be known as Madame de Staël. She has left some charming pages about her imprisonment in which we find, related with a fluent and subtle pen, the little romance which we proceed to outline. Mdile de Launay was secretary to the Duchess of Maine. She had some part in drawing up the scheme of the Celomare conspiracy, which if it had succeeded would have placed the King of Spain on the throne of France. On December 10, 1718, the regent sent her with several of her accomplices to the Bastille, less with the idea of punishing her for machinations against the state than to obtain from her details of the conspiracy. At that period of her life she was of but moderate fortune and rank, and it would not have been strange if she had been treated with rigor. She found at the Bastille, on the contrary, unexpected comfort and consideration. In her memoirs she writes that her sojourn at the Bastille was the pleasantest time of her life. Her maid, Rondel, was permitted to live with her. She was installed in a veritable suite of rooms. She complained of the mice there, and a cat was given her to drive out the mice and provide some amusement. By and by there were kittens, and the sportive tricks of the numerous little family cheered her wonderfully. She said, Mdile de Launay was regularly invited to dine with the governor. She spent her days in writing and card-playing. The king's lieutenant, Maison Rouge, a man well on in years, who held, after the governor, the first place in the administration of the Château, conceived a profound and pathetic passion for the fair prisoner. He declared that nothing would give him greater happiness than to make her his wife. His apartments happened to be near those of Mdile de Launay. Unhappily for the king's lieutenant, there was in the neighborhood a third suite, occupied by a young and brilliant nobleman, the Chevalier de Mainel, who also was implicated in the Celomare affair. The fair prisoner was not acquainted with him. Maison Rouge impresses us as a man of great dignity and rare nobility of character. He spoke to the two young prisoners about each other, hoping, by bringing them into communication, to provide them with fresh distractions. More particularly the lady whom he loved. The Chevalier de Mainel and Mdile de Launay could not see each other, they had never met. They began by exchanging epistles in verse. Like everything that came from her pen, the verses of Mdile de Launay were full of animation and charm. The good Maison Rouge played post between them, happy to see his little friend's delight in the diversion she owed to him. It was not long before the verses carried from one room to the other by Maison Rouge began to speak of love, and this love, surprising as it may seem but not difficult to understand in the sequestered life of the Bastille, ere long became real in the consciousness of the young people, who saw each other in imagination under the most charming colors. Maison Rouge was soon induced to contrive an interview between them. It is a delightful moment. The two captives had never seen each other, yet loved each other passionately. What will their mutual impressions be? Mdile de Launay's impression when she saw the gay Chevalier was of unmixed enthusiasm. The Chevalier, maybe, was more subdued. But if it is true, as someone has said, that to nuns the gardener represents mankind, to a prisoner every young woman must be an exquisite creature. The interviews continued under the benevolent eye of Maison Rouge, who watched the development of Mdile de Launay's love for Mainel, the love of the girl whom he himself loved intensely, but whose happiness he preferred to his own. There are delightful details which may be found delightfully described in Mdile de Launay's memoirs. It is M. Bournon's opinion that, according to the testimony of Mdile de Launay herself, this idol of the Bastille had the dénouement that might have been foretold. We have caught no hint of the sort in the memoirs of Madame de Staël, but then M. Bournon is no doubt the better psychologist. At any rate, the governor of the Bastille got wind of the diversions of the lovers. He put his foot down. Mainel was transferred to a distant tower. Mdile de Launay shed tears, and incredible as it seems, Maison Rouge, while redoubling his efforts to please her, sympathized with her lot to the point of arranging fresh and more difficult interviews with the sparkish Chevalier. Émile de Launay left the prison in the spring of 1720, after having sent to the regent a detailed statement of the facts of the conspiracy, which hitherto she had refused to furnish. Once at liberty, she vainly implored the Chevalier de Mainel to fulfill his pledges and make her his wife. Maison Rouge died in the following year of disappointment, says the gay coquette, at his failure to get from her during her imprisonment the promise of marriage which now she would have been glad enough to fulfill. It seems as though under the Regency everything at the Bastille turned on love, a reflection of the epic itself. The young Duc de Richelieu was locked up there because he did not love his wife. The brilliant nobleman was kept under lock and key for several weeks, in solitude and gloom, he says, when suddenly the door of his room flew open and Madame de Richelieu appeared, a wonder of grace, brightness, and charm. The fair angel, writes the Duke, who flew from heaven to earth to set Peter free was not so radiant. We have seen how the Bastille had been transformed from a military citadel into a prison of state. We shall now witness, under the government of the Duke of Orleans, another transformation betokened by an event which is of little apparent importance. The Duc de Richelieu was imprisoned in the Bastille a second time as the result of a duel. A judge of the Parliament went there to question him, and the Parliament tried his case. The Parliament at the Bastille in the prison of the king. From that moment the fortress continued year by year to grow more like our modern prisons. Under the Cardinal de Fleury, writes La Harpe, this famous château was inhabited by hardly any but Jansenist writers. It then became the enforced residence of champions of philosophy and authors of clandestine satires, and acted as a foil to their obscurity and shame. It became increasingly the practice to confine their accused persons whose cases were regularly tried at the Châtelet or even before the Parliament. By the second half of the 18th century, accused persons had come to be incarcerated in the Bastille by direct order of the Châtelet, which would have seemed incredible to a contemporary of Louis XIV. The summoning officer would post himself before the towers, and there, while the prisoner pressed his head close against the bars of the window, the officer would shout the terms of the writ at him across the moat. The advocates defending the accused obtained permission to go and consult their clients, and they were the only persons who were permitted to interview the prisoners in private. On the appointed day the prisoner was transferred to the law courts quietly, and by night to avoid the curiosity of the crowd. Under Louis XVI, the judges of the Parliament visited the Bastille as they visited the other prisons. At length the minister Bretuel sent instructions to the officials informing them that no more letters de cachet would be issued without stating the duration of the penalty to which the guilty person was condemned and the grounds for his punishment. The Bastille was now merely a prison like the others, except that the prisoners were better treated there. In 1713 Voisin, the Secretary of State, wrote to D'Argenson, Beaumaniel is not sufficiently deserving of consideration to warrant his removal from the Châtelet to the Bastille. La Harpe has well described the transformation which from this time came over the great state prison by saying that from the beginning of the century none of the prisoners who had been placed there had merited the honor. His remark receives corroboration from Linct. It is not in these latter days especially for criminals of state that the Bastille is reserved. It has become in some sort the antechamber of the conciergerie. If the glories of the Bastille paled as it grew older, on the other hand torture, which, it is true, had never been applied except by order of the courts, had completely disappeared. From the beginning of the 18th century, the cells and chains were merely a temporary punishment reserved for insubordinate prisoners. From the accession of Louis XVI, they had fallen into disuse. Bretuel forbade any person whatever to be placed in the cells, which were the rooms on the lowest floor of each tower, a sort of damp and gloomy vaults. On September 11, 1775, Malesherbes writes, "No prisoner should be refused material for reading and writing. The abuse it is pretended that they may make of it cannot be dangerous, confined so closely as they are, nor should any refusal be made to the desire of such as may wish to devote themselves to other occupations." provided they do not require you to leave in their hands tools of which they might avail themselves to effect their escape. If any of them should wish to write to his family and his friends, he must be permitted to receive replies and to send replies to their letters after having read them. In all this you must be guided by your prudence and your humanity. The reading of the gazettes, formerly rigidly forbidden, was now authorized. It must further be remarked that the number of prisoners confined in the Bastille was not so large as might be thought. During the whole reign of Louis XVI, the Bastille received no more than 240 prisoners, an average of 16 a year, while it had room for 42 in separate apartments. Under Louis XVI, at the period when the government was most liberal in dispensing its letters de cachet, an average of only 30 prisoners a year entered the Chateau, and their captivity was for the most part of short duration. Dumouriez informs us in his memoirs that during his detention he had never more than 18 fellow prisoners, and that more than once he had only 6. Alfred Begues has drawn up a list of the prisoners detained in the Bastille from 1781 to 1789. In May 1788, it contained 27 prisoners, the highest figure reached during these 8 years. In September 1782, it contained 10. In April 1783, 7. In June of the same year, 7. In December 1788, 9. In February 1789, 9. At the time of its capture, July 14, 1789, there were 7. True, not only men were locked up in the Bastille, but also books when they appeared dangerous. The royal warrant under which they were incarcerated was even drawn up on the model of the letters de cachet. M. Bournon has published a specimen of these. The books were shut up in a closet between the towers of the treasure and the county, over an old passage communicating with the bastion. In 1733, the lieutenant of police instructed the governor of the Bastille to receive at the Chateau all the apparatus of a clandestine printing press which had been seized in a chamber of the St. Victor Abbey, the which you will be good enough to have placed in the storeroom of the Bastille. When the books ceased to appear dangerous, they were set at liberty. In this way the encyclopedia was liberated after a detention of some years. We have just seen that during the reign of Louis XVI, the Bastille did not receive more than 16 prisoners a year on an average. Several of these were only detained for a few days. From 1783 to 1789, the Bastille remained almost empty, and would have been absolutely empty if it had not been decided to place their prisoners who should properly have been elsewhere. As early as February 1784, the fortress of Vincennes, which served as a sort of overflow pipe to the Bastille, had been shut for lack of prisoners. The system of letters de cachet was slipping away into the past. On the other hand, the Bastille was a source of great expense to the king. The governor alone received 60,000 livres annually. When you add the salaries and board of the officers of the garrison, the turnkeys, the physicians, the surgeon, the apothecary, the chaplains, when you add the food, this alone in 1774 came to 67,000 livres, and the clothing of the prisoners and the upkeep of the buildings, the total will appear outrageous, for the figures given above must be tripled to represent the value of the present day. So Necker, seeing that the Bastille was of no further utility, thought of suppressing it for economy's sake, and he was not the only one in high places to speak of this suppression. The Carnavalet Museum possesses a scheme drawn up in 1784 by Courbet, the superintending architect to the city of Paris, whence the project has an official character. It is a scheme for a place Louis XVI, to be opened up on the site of the old fortress. We learn from Millon that other artists were occupied with a scheme for erecting a monument on the site of the Bastille. One of these schemes deserves special mention. 7 of the 8 towers were to be destroyed, the 8th to remain standing, but in a significant state of dilapidation. On the site of the demolished towers, a monument was to be erected to the glory of Louis XVI. This monument was to consist of a pedestal formed by piling up chains and bolts taken from the state prison, above which would rise a statue of the king, one hand extended towards the ruined tower with the gesture of a deliverer. It is to be regretted, if not for the beauty at least for the picturesqueness of Paris, that this scheme was never put into execution. Davy de Chavigny, king's counselor and auditor to the treasury, was allowed to present to the Royal Academy of Architecture at its sitting on June 8, 1789, a plan for a monument on the site of the Bastille to be decreed by the States General to Louis XVI, as the restorer of the public liberty. On this subject, the famous sculptor Houdon wrote to Chavigny, "I am very anxious for the plan to be adopted. The idea of erecting a monument to liberty on the very spot where slavery has reigned up to the present appears to me particularly well conceived and well calculated to inspire genius. I shall think myself only too fortunate to be among the artists who will celebrate the epoch of the regeneration of France. We have seen prints, long anterior to 1789, one of them the frontispiece of the edition of Linck's memoirs that appeared in 1783, representing Louis XVI, extending his hand towards the lofty towers which workmen are in the act of demolishing." Among the archives of the Bastille are preserved two reports drawn up in 1788 by the king's lieutenant Puget, the most important personage in the fortress after the governor. He proposes the suppression of the state prison, the demolition of the old Chateau, and the sale of the ground for the benefit of the crown. It may be said of these schemes, as of the plan of the architect Corbett, that they would not have been propounded if they had not been approved in high places. Further, in the year 1784, an ardent supporter of the old state of things cried, "Oh, if our young monarch ever committed a fault so great, if he so far belied the most ancient usages of this government, if it were possible that one day he could be tempted to destroy you, the author is apostrophizing the Bastille, to raise on your ruins a monument to the Liberator King." The demolition of the Bastille was decided on, and it would have been accomplished as a government undertaking but for the outbreak of the Revolution. From January 1 to July 14, 1789, that is to say for more than 6 months, only one solitary prisoner entered the Bastille, and what a prisoner! Ravelin, the paper manufacturer of the suburb Saint-Anton, who was shut up on May 1 at his own request in order to escape the fury of the mob. The same year, the lieutenant of police de Crosny made an inspection of the Bastille accompanied by a judge of the Parliament. Their object was to arrange officially about the destruction of the state prison. Thus, on the eve of the Revolution, the Bastille no longer existed, though its towers were still standing. The victors of the 14th of July set free 7 prisoners, 4 forgers whose arrest had been ordered by the Chatelet, whose case had been regularly tried, and whose proper place was an ordinary prison, 2 madmen who ought to have been at Charenton, and the Comte de Soliges, a young nobleman who had been guilty of a monstrous crime over which it was desired to throw a veil out of regard for his family. He was maintained on a pension paid by his father. The conquerors of the Bastille destroyed an old fortified castle. The state prison no longer existed. They broke in an open door. That was said of them even in 1789. Chapter II. Life in the Bastille. Having sketched rapidly and with bold strokes the outlines of the history of the Bastille from its foundation to its fall, we intend to show how the rule to which prisoners in the fortress of the suburb Saint-Anton were submitted underwent its own process of transformation, parallel with the transformation of the prison itself. To understand the facts which follow, and which are of a kind to astound the mind of everyone in these days, it is necessary to remember what we have already said as to the character of the Bastille. It was the prison of luxury, the aristocratic prison of the ancient regime, the prison de luxe at a period when it was no dishonor, as we shall see later, to be confined there. We must remember the phrase of the minister of Paris writing to D'Argenson in regard to a personage of but modest rank, that this individual did not deserve consideration enough to be put in the Bastille. Let us reflect on this observation of Mercier in his excellent pictures of Paris. The people fear the chatelet more than the Bastille. Of the latter they have no dread because it is almost unknown to them. We have shown how the Bastille, originally a military citadel, had become a prison of state, then little by little had approximated to the ordinary prisons, until the day when it died a natural death ere it could be assassinated. The same transformation took place in the treatment of the prisoners. Midway in the 17th century, the Bastille had none of the characteristics of a prison, but was simply a chateau in which the king caused certain of his subjects to sojourn, for one cause or another. They lived there just as they thought proper, furnishing their rooms according to their fancy with their own furniture, indulging their tastes in regard to food at their own expense, and waited on by their own servants. When a prisoner was rich, he could live at the Bastille in princely style. When he was poor, he lived there very wretchedly. When the prisoner had no property at all, the king did not for that reason give him furniture or food, but he gave him money which he might use as seemed good to him in providing himself with furniture and food, money of which he could retain a part. A number of prisoners did not fail to do so, these savings becoming his own property. This system, the character of which it is important to recognize, underwent gradual modification during the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, approximating without ever becoming identical with the system of our modern prisons. Thus the king, instead of granting pensions individually to the poorest of the prisoners, came to endow the Bastille with a certain fixed number of pensions for the less fortunate prisoners. The recipients of these pensions continued to enjoy them for long years, and if they did not wish the whole of the money to be expended on their support, the balance was handed over to them. So we see certain individuals getting little fortunes together by the mere fact of their having been prisoners in the Bastille, a circumstance which has so much surprised historians because they have not sought its cause. It even happened that prisoners, when their liberation was announced to them, asked to remain a little longer in order to swell their savings, a favor which was sometimes granted them. In the course of the 18th century, the money destined to the maintenance of the prisoners at the Bastille could not be diverted from its purpose. The prisoners were no longer able to appropriate a part. The whole sum had to be expended. It was only in the second half of the 17th century that the king had some rooms at the Bastille furnished for such prisoners as were without means of procuring furniture themselves. And it is very interesting to note that it was only at the extreme end of the century, under the administration of Saint Mars, that certain apartments of the Bastille were arranged in the prison style with bars and bolts. Until then they had been simply the rooms of a stronghold. Let us follow the prisoner from his entrance to his exit. When the letter de cachet had been signed, it was usually a sort of sheriff's officer who effected the arrest. He appeared in company with 5 or 6 men-at-arms and signified the arrest by touching his quarry with a white staff. A coach was in waiting. The police officer politely begged the person he was instructed to secure to step into the coach and took his place beside him. And according to the testimony of various memoirs, while the vehicle was rolling along with lowered blinds, there was a pleasant conversational exchange of courtesies up to the moment of the prisoner's finding himself within the walls of the Bastille. A certain Lafort was living in furnished apartments with a young and pretty Englishwoman whom he had abducted, when one evening about sunset a police officer arrived. The coach was at the door. Preliminaries were settled on both sides with as much politeness as if a visit or an evening party had been the topic of discussion. They all got into the vehicle, even the young man's lackey who, beguiled by appearances, mounted behind. Arrived at the Bastille, the lackey lost no time in descending to open the door. There was general astonishment, especially on the part of the poor servant, when he learnt that since he had entered the Bastille along with his master, he must stay with him. Most often the officer and his companions surprised their quarry early in the morning on rising from bed. Imagine then the coach with the prisoner and the police officer inside, arriving before the Bastille in the first court in front of the castle keep. "Who goes there?" cries the sentinel. "The king's writ," replies the officer. At this, the shops we have seen attached to the flanks of the chateau are bound at once to be shut. The soldiers on guard have to turn their faces to the wall or perhaps to pull their hats over their eyes. The coach passes the outpost, a bell sounds. "Advance!" cries the officer on duty. The drawbridge is lowered and the coach rattles over the stout iron-clamped boards. For greater secrecy, spies and prisoners of war were taken in by a private door leading to the gardens of the arsenal. Officers and noblemen presented themselves before the Bastille alone, unless they were accompanied by relatives or friends. "It is my intention," the king had written to them, "that you betake yourselves to my shade of the Bastille," and no one dreamt of declining the royal invitation. Further, when the governor desired to transfer one of them from one prison to another, he contented himself with telling him so. We find in the journal of Du Junca, King's lieutenant at the Bastille, several notes like the following. Monday, December 26, 1695, about 10 o'clock in the morning, M. de Villers, lieutenant colonel of the regiment of Vosges infantry, came and reported himself a prisoner as ordered by M. Barbezieux, though he was a prisoner in the citadel of Grenoble, whence he came direct without being brought by anyone. On the arrival of the prisoner, the king's lieutenant, accompanied by the captain of the gates, came to receive him as he got out of his carriage. The officers of the Chateau at once led the newcomer into the presence of the governor, who received him civilly, invited him to sit down, and after having endorsed the letter de cachet, conversed with him for some time. Under Louis XIV, the governor in most cases even kept his new guest, as well as the persons who had accompanied him, to lunch or dinner. Meanwhile his quarters had been got ready. We read in Du Junca's journal that on January 26, 1695, a certain de Curlenden, a colonel of cavalry, presented himself for incarceration at the Bastille. There being no room ready to receive him, the governor asked him to go and pass the night in a neighboring inn at the sign of the Crown and to return next day. Whereupon M. de Curlenden did not fail to return about 11 o'clock in the morning, having dined with M. de Bismuth, the governor, and in the afternoon he entered the Chateau. The reader will not be surprised at learning that the prospect of incarceration at the Bastille did not always strike the future prisoner with terror. We read in the memoirs of the Duc de Lauzun, "Scolded for 2 hours on end by everybody who fancied himself entitled to do so, I thought I could not do better than go to Paris and await developments." Few hours after my arrival, I received a letter from my father telling me that it had been decided to put us all in the Bastille, and that I should probably be arrested during the night. I determined at least to finish gaily, so I invited some pretty girls from the opera to supper, so that I might await the officer without impatience. Seeing that he did not arrive, I determined on the bold move of going to Fontainebleau and joining the king's hunt. He did not speak to me once during the chase, which was such a confirmation of our disgrace that on our return no one gave us the customary salute. But I did not lose heart. In the evening I was in attendance and the king came to me. "You are all," he said, "hot-headed rips, but funny dogs all the same. Come along and have supper, and bring M. de Guémené and the Chevalier de Luxembourg." Before the new arrival was installed in the chamber prepared for him, he was taken to the great council hall, where he was requested to empty his pockets. Only notorious rogues were searched. If the prisoner had upon him money, jewels, or other articles such as knives and scissors, the use of which was not allowed by the regulations, they were done up in a parcel which he himself sealed with his own seal if he had one, if not, with the seal of the Bastille. Finally, he was conducted to the room reserved for him. Each of the 8 towers of the Bastille contained 4 or 5 stories of rooms or cells. The worst of these rooms were on the lowest floor, and these were what were called the cells, octagonal vaults, cold and damp, partly underground. The walls, gray with mold, were bare from floor to ceiling, the latter a groined arch. A bench and a bed of straw covered with a paltry coverlet formed the whole appointments. Daylight feebly flickered through the vent-hole opening on to the moat. When the Seine was in flood, the water came through the walls and swamped the cells, and then any prisoners who might happen to be in them were removed. during the reign of Louis XIV. The cells were sometimes occupied by prisoners of the lowest class and criminals condemned to death. Later, under Louis XV, the cells ceased to be used except as a place of punishment for insubordinate prisoners who assaulted their guardians or fellow prisoners, or for turnkeys and sentinels of the Chateau who had committed breaches of discipline. They stayed in the cells for a short time in irons. The cells had fallen into disuse by the time the revolution broke out. Since the first ministry of Necker, it had been forbidden to confine in them anyone whatever, and none of the warders questioned on July 18 remembered having seen anyone placed in them. The two prisoners, Tavernier and Baychade, whom the conquerors of the 14th of July found in one of these dungeons, had been placed there at the moment of the attack by the officers of the Chateau, for fear lest amid the rain of bullets some harm should befall them. The worst rooms after the cells were the calots, the rooms on the floor above. In summer the heat was extreme in them, and in winter the cold in spite of the stoves. They were octagons whose ceilings, as the name implies, were shaped like a skull cap. High enough in the center, they gradually diminished in height towards the sides. It was impossible to stand upright except in the middle of the room. The prisoners were only placed in the cells and calots under exceptional circumstances. Every tower had 2 or 3 floors of lofty and airy chambers, and in these the prisoners lived. They were octagons from 15 to 16 feet in diameter and from 15 to 20 feet high. Light entered through large windows approached by 3 steps. We have said that it was only towards the end of Louis XIV reign that these rooms were arranged like prison cells with bars and bolts. They were warmed with open fireplaces or stoves. The ceiling was whitewashed, the floor of brick. On the walls the prisoners had chalked verses, mottos, and designs. One artistic prisoner amused himself by decorating the bare walls with paintings. The governor, delighted at seeing him thus find relaxation, moved him from room to room. When he had finished filling one with his designs and arabesques, he was placed in another. Some of these rooms were decorated with portraits of Louis XIV. Placed above the chimney-piece, a characteristic detail which helps to show what the Bastille was at this period. The Chateau of the king, where the king received a certain number of his subjects as his willing or unwilling guests. The best rooms in the Bastille were those that were fitted up in the 18th century for the accommodation of the staff. These were what were called the suites. In these were placed invalids and prisoners of distinction. At the beginning of the 18th century, the furniture of these apartments was still extremely simple. They were absolutely empty. The reason of this we have indicated above. I arrived, says Madame de Staël, at a room where there was nothing but 4 walls, very filthy and daubed all over by my predecessors for want of something better to do. It was so destitute of furniture that someone went and got a little straw chair for me to sit on, and 2 stones to support a lighted faggot, and a little candle end was neatly stuck on the wall to give me light. The prisoners sent to their own homes for a table, bed, and chair, or they hired these from the upholsterer of the Bastille. When they had nothing to bless themselves with, the government, as we have already said, did not provide them with furniture. It gave them money, sometimes considerable sums, which permitted them to adorn their rooms after their own fancy. This was the case in regard to all prisoners up to 1684. At this date the king ordered the administration to supply furniture to those of the prisoners whose detention was to be kept secret, for by getting in bedding from their own houses or the houses of friends, they made known their arrest. D'Argenson had half a dozen of the rooms permanently furnished. Others were furnished under Louis XV. Under Louis XVI, almost all were furnished. The appointments were very modest. A bed of green baize with curtains, 1 or 2 tables, several chairs, fire dogs, a shovel, and a small pair of tongs. But after having undergone examination, the prisoner retained the right of getting in furniture from outside. And in this way the rooms of the prisoners were sometimes adorned with great elegance. Madame de Staël relates that she had hers hung with tapestry. The Marquis de Sade covered the bare walls with long and brilliant hangings. Other prisoners ornamented their rooms with family portraits. They procured chests of drawers, desks, round tables, dressing cases, armchairs, cushions in Utrecht velvet. The inventories of articles belonging to the prisoners show that they managed to secure everything they thought necessary. The Abbé Brigault, who was imprisoned at the same time as Madame de Staël and for the same affair, brought into the Bastille 5 armchairs, 2 pieces of tapestry, 11 serge hangings, 8 chairs, a bureau, a small table, 3 pictures, and see the list of effects taken out of the Bastille by the Comte de Belle-Isle when he was set at liberty, includes a library consisting of 333 volumes and 10 atlases, a complete service of fine linen and plate for the table, a bed furnished with gold-bordered red damask, 4 pieces of tapestry on antique subjects, 2 mirrors, a screen of gold-bordered red damask matching the bed, 2 folding screens, 2 armchairs with cushions, an armchair in leather, 3 chairs in tapestry, an overmantel of gilt copper, tables, drawers, stands, candlestick of plated copper. And see, we might multiply examples, even from among prisoners of middle station. It was the rule that prisoners newly arrived at the Bastille should be examined within 24 hours. It sometimes happened, however, that one or another remained for 2 or 3 weeks before appearing before the magistrate. The Châtelet commissioner, specially delegated to the Bastille for these examinations, founded his questions on notes supplied him by the lieutenant of police, who indeed often went in person to see the prisoners. A special commission was appointed for affairs of importance. Dumouriez says that he was examined after 9 hours of detention by 3 commissioners. The president was an old councillor of state named Marville, a man of intelligence but coarse and sarcastic. The second was M. de Sartine, lieutenant of police and councillor of state, a man of polish and refinement. The third was a maître des requêtes named Villavox, a very insincere and disputatious fellow. The clerk, who had more intelligence than any of them, was an advocate named Beaumont. We have found many instances of prisoners who spoke in high terms of their judges, and it cannot be said that prisoners at the Bastille escaped judgment. A Châtelet commissioner examined them and sent the official report of his examination with a statement of his opinion to the lieutenant of police. He decided whether the arrest should be sustained. Moreover, it would be a mistake to compare the lieutenant of police under the ancient regime with the prefect of police of today. The lieutenants of police, selected from former maîtres des requêtes, had a judicial character. The documents of the period call them magistrates. They issued decrees without appeal and pronounced penal sentences, even condemning to the galleys. They were at the same time justices of the peace with an extensive jurisdiction. In addition to the examination held on the entrance of a prisoner, the lieutenants of police, in the course of their frequent visits, addressed to the ministers of Paris reports on the prisoners, reports in which they discussed the evidence and which constituted veritable judgments. When the prisoner was recognized as innocent, a new letter de cachet soon set him at liberty. The verdict of no true bill often supervened with a rapidity which the decisions of our police magistrates would do well to emulate. A certain Barbier, who entered the Bastille on February 15, 1753, was found not guilty and set at liberty the next day. Of the 279 persons imprisoned in the Bastille during the last 15 years of the ancient regime, 38 benefited by the dropping of the indictment. Finally, and here is a point on which the new method might well model itself on that of the Bastille, when a detention was recognized as unjust, the victim was indemnified. A great number of examples might be mentioned. An advocate named Sabé left the Bastille on June 18, 1767, after a detention of 18 days. He had been falsely accused of the authorship of a book against the king and received compensation to the tune of 3,000 livres, more than 240 pounds of our money. A certain Pereira, imprisoned in the Bastille from November 7, 1771 to April 12, 1772, and then from July 1 to September 26, 1774, having been found to be innocent, was reinstated in all his property, and received from the king a life pension of 1,200 livres, more than 100 pounds today. A certain number of those accused in the Canada case when the charge was withdrawn received a life pension on leaving the Bastille. At other times, the detention of an individual might throw his family into want. He was kept in the Bastille if it was thought he deserved it, but his people were assisted. Under date September 3, 1763, the Duc de Choiseul writes to the Lieutenant of Police, "I have received the letter you did me the honor of writing to me in favor of the children of the Sea Urchin Kerchabert. I have the pleasure to inform you that I have got for them a second subsidy of 300 livres, nearly 30 pounds today, in consideration of the sad condition you informed me they were in. Louis XIV. Guaranteed to Pelisson at his liberation a pension of 2,000 crowns. The regent granted to Voltaire when he left the Bastille a pension of 1,200 livres. Louis XVI awarded to Latude an annuity of 400 livres and to La Roche-Guirault an annuity of 400 crowns. The minister Bretuel pensionned all the prisoners whom he set at liberty. Brun de Condamine, confined from 1779 to 1783, received on leaving a sum of 600 livres. Renville speaks of a prisoner to whom Seignelay gave an important situation in compensation for his detention at the Bastille. We hear of one, Toussaint Saucourt, a commissioner of the Chatelet and of police whose offices were restored to him when he came out of the Bastille. In fact, contrary to detention in our modern prisons, incarceration in the Bastille did not cast the slightest slur on the prisoner's character, even in the eyes of those to whom his arrest was due, and instances have been known of men who, on their release from the Bastille, not only were reinstated in public offices but reached the highest positions. Until his examinations were quite completed, the prisoner was kept in close confinement. None but the officers of the Château were allowed to communicate with him, and during this time he lived in solitude unless he had brought a servant with him. The administration readily permitted the prisoners to avail themselves of the services of their valets, who were boarded at the king's expense. It even happened that the government sometimes gave their prisoners valets, paying not only for their board, but also their wages at the rate of 900 livres a year. One might cite prisoners of inferior rank who thus had servants to wait on them. 2 or 3 prisoners were sometimes put together in one room. Prison life has no greater terror than solitude. In absolute solitude, many of the prisoners became mad. In company, the hours of captivity seemed less tedious and oppressive. Father and son, mother and daughter, aunt and niece lived together. Many might be named. On September 7, 1693, a lady named de La Fontaine was taken to the Bastille for the second time. The first time she had been imprisoned quite alone, but this new detention evoked the compassion of the lieutenant of police, who, to please the poor lady, sent her husband to the Bastille, locked him up with her, and gave them a lackey to wait on them. The examinations being ended, the prisoners enjoyed a greater liberty. They could then enter into communication with the people of the town. They obtained permission to see their relatives and friends. These sometimes paid them visits in their rooms, but as a rule the interviews took place in the council hall, in presence of one of the officers of the Château. They were usually permitted to discuss only family affairs and business matters. All conversation on the Bastille and the reasons for their imprisonment was forbidden. The rules of the prison increased in severity as time went on. Towards the end of Louis XV's reign, the lieutenant of police went so far as to prescribe the subjects of conversation which would alone be permitted in the course of the visits the prisoners received. They may talk to the prisoner about the harvest his vineyards will yield this year, about canceling a lease, about a match for his niece, about the health of his parents. But it is necessary to read the memoirs of Gerville, Fontaine, Bussy Rabutin, Hennequin, Madame de Staël, the Duc de Richelieu to form a general idea of life at the Bastille under Louis XIV and under the Regent. Several prisoners were free to move about through the Château wherever it seemed good to them. They entered the rooms of their fellow prisoners at all hours of the day. The governor contented himself with locking them in their own rooms at night. The prisoners who had the liberty of the court organized games of bowls or tonneau and hobnobbed with the officers of the garrison. Fontaine relates that they might have been seen from the top of the towers. Collected 50 at a time in the inner court, Bussy Rabutin's room was open to all comers. His wife and friends visited him. He gave dinners to persons from court, plotted love intrigues there, and corresponded freely with his friends and relatives. Several prisoners even had permission to take a walk into the town on condition of their returning to the Château in the evening. 2 brothers were placed in the Bastille together. They went out when they pleased, taking turns. It was sufficient for one or other to be always at the Château. The officers of the staff gossiped with the prisoners and gave them advice as to the best means of obtaining their liberty. This animated, courtly, and elegant life is described with infinite charm by Madame de Staël, whom we have already cited. We all used to spend a part of the day with the governor. We dined with him, and after dinner I enjoyed a rubber of amber with Messieurs de Pompadour and de Boistevis, Maynel advising me. When it was over, we returned to our own apartments. The company met again in my rooms before supper, for which we returned to the governor, and after that we all went to bed. As to the manner in which the prisoners were fed and looked after, that is surprising indeed, and what we shall say about it, though rigidly accurate, will perhaps be regarded as an exaggeration. The governor drew 3 livers a day for the maintenance of a man of inferior rank, 5 livers for the maintenance of a tradesman, 10 livers for a banker, a magistrate, or a man of letters, 15 livers for a judge of the Parliament, 36 livers for a marshal of France. The Cardinal de Rohan had 120 francs a day spent on him. The Prince de Curland, during a stay of 5 months at the Bastille, spent 22,000 francs. These figures must be doubled and trebled to give the value they would represent today. We read, too, with the greatest astonishment, the description of the meals the prisoners made. Renville, whose evidence is the more important in that his book is a pamphlet against the administration of the Bastille, speaks in these terms of his first meal. The turnkey put one of my serviettes on the table and placed my dinner on it, which consisted of pea soup garnished with lettuce, well simmered and appetizing to look at, with a quarter of fowl to follow. In one dish there was a juicy beefsteak, with plenty of gravy and a sprinkling of parsley. In another, a quarter of forcemeat pie well stuffed with sweetbreads, coxcombs, asparagus, mushrooms, and truffles, and in a third a ragout of sheep's tongue, the whole excellently cooked. For dessert, a biscuit and 2 pippins. The turnkey insisted on pouring out my wine. This was good Burgundy, and the bread was excellent. I asked him to drink, but he declared it was not permitted. I asked if I should pay for my food, or whether I was indebted to the king for it. He told me that I had only to ask freely for whatever would give me pleasure, that they would try to satisfy me, and that His Majesty paid for it all. The most Christian king desired that his guests should fast on Fridays and in Lent, but he did not treat them any the worse on that account. I had, says Renville, 6 dishes and an admirable prawn soup. Among the fish there was a very fine weaver, a large fried sole, and a perch, all very well seasoned, with 3 other dishes. At this period Reneville's board cost 10 francs a day. Later he was reduced to the rate of the prisoners of a lower class. They much reduced my usual fare, he says. I had, however, a good soup with fried bread crumbs, a passable piece of beef, a ragout of sheep's tongue, and 2 custards for dessert. I was treated in pretty much the same manner the whole time I was in this gloomy place. Sometimes they gave me, after my soup, a wing or leg of fowl. Sometimes they put 2 little patties on the edge of the dish. Towards the end of Louis XV, Reine Dumouriez eulogizes the cookery of the Bastille in almost the same terms. On the day of his entrance, noticing that they were serving a fish dinner, he asked for a fowl to be got from a neighboring eating house. "A fowl," said the major. "Don't you know that today is Friday? Your business is to look after me and not my conscience. I am an invalid, for the Bastille itself is a disease," replied the prisoner. In an hour's time the fowl was on the table. Subsequently, he asked for his dinner and supper to be served at the same time between 3 and 4 o'clock. His valet, a good cook, used to make him stews. "You fared very well at the Bastille. There were always 5 dishes at dinner and 3 at supper, without the dessert, and the whole being put on the table at once appeared magnificent." There is a letter from the major of the Bastille addressed in 1764 to the lieutenant of police, discussing a prisoner named Ville, who never ate butcher's meat, so they had to feed him exclusively on game and poultry. Things were much the same under Louis XVI. As Poultier Delmotte testifies, Delaunay the governor used to come and have a friendly chat with me. He got them to consult my taste as regards food, and to supply me with anything I wished for. The bookseller Hardy, transferred in 1766 to the Bastille with the members of the Breton deputation, declares frankly that they were all treated in the best possible way. Finally, Lingt himself, in spite of his desire to paint the lot of the victims of the Bastille in the most somber colors, is obliged to confess that food was supplied in abundance. Every morning the cook sent up to him a menu on which he marked the dishes he fancied. The account books of the Bastille confirm the testimony of former prisoners. The following, according to these documents, are the meals that La Bourdonnais enjoyed during July 1750. Every day the menu contains soup, beef, veal, beans, French beans, 2 eggs, bread, strawberries, cherries, gooseberries, oranges, 2 bottles of red wine, and 2 bottles of beer. In addition to this regular bill of fare, we note on July 2, a fowl and a bottle of muscat, on the 4th a bottle of muscat, on the 7th tea, on the 12th a bottle of brandy, on the 13th some flowers, on the 14th some quails, on the 15th a turkey, on the 16th a melon, on the 17th a fowl, on the 18th a young rabbit, on the 19th a bottle of brandy, on the 20th a chicken and ham sausage and 2 melons, and so on. Tavernier was a prisoner of mean station, son of a doorkeeper of Paris de Montmartre. He was implicated in a plot against the king's life and was one of the 7 prisoners set free on the 14th of July. He was found out of his mind in his cell. After he had been led in triumph through the streets of Paris, he was shut up at Charenton. He was a martyr, people exclaimed. He was certainly not so well off in his new abode as he had been at the Bastille. We have an account of what was supplied to him at the Bastille in addition to the ordinary meals in November 1788, in March and May 1789, 3 of the last months of his imprisonment. In November we find tobacco, 4 bottles of brandy, 60 bottles of wine, 30 bottles of beer, 2 pounds of coffee, 3 pounds of sugar, a turkey, oysters, chestnuts, apples, and pears. In March, tobacco, 4 bottles of brandy, 44 bottles of wine, 60 bottles of beer, coffee, sugar, fowls, cheese. In May, tobacco, 4 bottles of brandy, 62 bottles of wine, 31 bottles of beer, pigeons, coffee, sugar, cheese, and see we have the menus of the Marquis de Sade for January 1789. Chocolate cream, a fat chicken stuffed with chestnuts, pullets with truffles, potted ham, apricot marmalade, and c. The facts we are describing were the rule. The prisoners who were treated with the least consideration fed very well. Only those who were sent down to the cells were sometimes put on bread and water, but that was only a temporary punishment. When a complaint was formulated by any prisoner in regard to his food, a reprimand to the governor soon followed. Then the lieutenant of police inquired of the person concerned if he was better treated than formerly. "His Majesty tells me," writes Pontchartrain to Delaunay, "that complaints have been raised about the bad food of the prisoners. He instructs me to write to you to give the matter great attention." And Sartine wrote jokingly to Major de Lausmes, I am quite willing for you to get the clothes of Sieur Dubois enlarged, and I hope all your prisoners may enjoy as excellent health. Further, the king clothed those of the prisoners who were too poor to buy their own clothes. He did not give them a prison uniform, but dressing gowns padded or lined with rabbit skin, breeches of colored stuff, vests lined with silk plush, and fancy coats. The commissary at the Bastille appointed to look after the supplies took the prisoners' measure and inquired about their tastes and the colors and styles that suited them best. A lady prisoner named Sauvé asked to have made for her a dress of white silk, dotted with green flowers. The wife of Commissary Rochebrune spent several days in going the round of the Paris shops, and then wrote in despair that no dressmaker had such a material, the nearest approach to it being a white silk with green stripes. If Madame Sauvé would be satisfied with that, they would send to take her measure. Monsieur le Major, writes a prisoner named Hugonet, the shirts they brought me yesterday are not a bit what I asked for I remember having written fine and with embroidered ruffles, instead of which these things are coarse, made of wretched linen and with ruffles at best only fit for a turnkey. And so I shall be glad if you will send them back to the commissary and let him keep them, for I declare I won't have them. The governor also saw that the prisoners had some means of diversion. The poorest he provided with pocket money and tobacco. About the beginning of the 17th century, a Neapolitan named Vinesh died at the Bastille, after founding a library there for the use of his fellow prisoners. This library was gradually augmented by donations from the governors, by gifts from various prisoners, and even by the generosity of a citizen of Paris whose compassion had been excited for the lot of the prisoners. The books consisted of romances, works of science and philosophy, and religious books, light literature predominating. The lieutenant of police, Barrier, struck out of the list of books that were being sent one day to the binder a poem on the greatness of God, as being on too melancholy a subject for prisoners. The prisoners also procured books from outside. We have mentioned the Comte de Belle-Isle, who had more than 300 books and atlases at the Bastille. La Beaumelle collected a library of more than 600 volumes. The administration, moreover, never refused to get for the prisoners, out of the royal funds and sometimes at considerable expense, such works as they said were necessary to their studies. The works of Voltaire and Puffendorf were readily placed in their hands. Finally, under Louis XVI, they were allowed to read the gazettes. After the permission to have books and to write, the most coveted favor was that of walking exercise. Refusal of this was rare. The prisoners might walk either on the towers of the Bastille or in the inner courts, or lastly along the bastion, which was transformed into a garden. To fresh invigorating air, the platform of the towers added the attraction of the finest view. Fontaine relates that Sacy went to the top of the towers every day after dinner. He there walked about in company with the officers, who gave him news of the town and the prisoners. In their rooms the prisoners amused themselves with feeding cats and birds and animals of all kinds. They taught dogs tricks. Some were allowed to have a violin or a clavecin. Pelisson was shut up with a Basque who used to play to him on the musette. The Duc de Richelieu boasts of the operatic airs he sang in parts with his neighbors in the Bastille Deal. Delaunay among them, with her head at the bars of her window, we got up choruses of a sort. With fine effect. Other prisoners killed time with embroidery, weaving, or knitting. Some made ornaments for the chapel of the Chateau. Some devoted themselves to carpentry, turned wood, made small articles of furniture. Artists painted and sketched. The occupation of M. de Villeroy was somewhat singular. He had very fine clothes, which he was forever unpicking and sewing together again with much cleverness. The prisoners, who lived several in one room, played at cards, chess, and backgammon. In 1788, at the time of the troubles in Brittany, a dozen noblemen of that country were shut up in the Bastille. They lived together and asked for a billiard table to amuse themselves. The table was set up in the apartments of the major, and there these gentlemen went for their games. The prisoners who died in the Bastille were interred in the graveyard of St. Paul's. The funeral service was held in the church of St. Paul, and the burial certificate bearing the family name of the deceased was drawn up in the vestry. It is not true that the names of the deceased were wrongly stated in the register in order that their identity might be concealed from the public. The man in the iron mask was inscribed on the register of St. Paul under his real name. Jews, Protestants, and suicides were buried in the garden of the Chateau, the prejudices of the period not allowing their remains to be laid in consecrated ground. Those who were liberated had a happier fate. Their dismissal was ordered by a letter de cachet as their incarceration had been. These orders for their liberation, so anxiously expected, were brought by the court distributors of packets or by the ordinary post. Sometimes relatives and friends themselves brought the sealed envelope, in order to have the joy of taking away at once those whose deliverance they came to effect. The governor, or in his absence the king's lieutenant, came into the prisoner's chamber and announced that he was free. The papers and other effects which had been taken from him on entrance were restored to him, the major getting a receipt for them. Then he signed a promise to reveal nothing of what he had seen at the Chateau. Many of the prisoners refused to submit to this formality and were liberated notwithstanding. Others, after having signed, retailed everywhere all they knew about the prison and were not interfered with. When the prisoner only recovered his freedom under certain conditions, he was required to give an undertaking to submit to the king's pleasure. All these formalities having been completed, the governor, with that feeling for good form which characterized the men of the ancient regime, had the man who had been his guest served for the last time with an excellent dinner. If the prisoner was a man of good society, the governor would even go so far as to invite him to his own table, and then the meal over and the goodbyes said, he placed his own carriage at the prisoner's disposal, and often entered it himself to accompany him to his destination. More than one prisoner thus restored to the world must have felt greatly embarrassed before a day was past, and have been at a loss what to do or where to go. The administration of the Bastille sometimes gave money to one and another to enable them to get along for a time. In December 1783, a certain Dubout de la Tagnerette, after being set at liberty, was lodged in the governor's house for a fortnight until he had found apartments that would suit him. Moreover, many of the prisoners were actually annoyed at being dismissed. We could cite examples of persons who sought to get themselves sent to the Bastille, others refused to accept their liberty, and others did their best to get their detention prolonged. Many come out, says Renville, very sad at having to leave. Le Maistre de Sacy and Fontaine affirm that the years spent at the Bastille were the best years in their lives. The innocent life we lived, says Renville again, Messrs. Hamilton, Schrader, and myself seemed so pleasant to M. Hamilton that he begged me to write a description of it in verse. The memoirs of Madame de Staël represent her years at the Bastille as the happiest she ever knew. In my heart of hearts, I was very far from desiring my liberty. I stayed at the Bastille for 6 weeks, observes the Abbé Morlet, which sped away, I chuckle still as I think of them, very pleasantly for me. And later, Dumouriez declares that at the Bastille he was happy and never felt dull. Such was the rule of the celebrated state prison. In the last century there was no place of detention in Europe where the prisoners were surrounded with so many comforts and attentions. There is no such place in these days. But in spite of these very real alleviations, it would be absurd to pretend that the prisoners were in general reconciled to their incarceration. Nothing is a consolation for the loss of liberty. How many poor wretches in their despair have dashed their heads against the thick walls while wife and children and concerns of the utmost gravity were summoning them from without. The Bastille was the cause of ruin to many. Within its walls were shed tears which were never dried. An 18th century writer thus defined the state prison. A Bastille is any house solidly built, hermetically sealed and diligently guarded, where any person of whatever rank, age, or sex may enter without knowing why, remain without knowing how long, hoping to leave it but not knowing how. These lines, written by an apologist for the old state prison, contain its condemnation without appeal before the modern mind. Chapter IV. The Man in the Iron Mask. For 2 centuries, no question has excited public opinion more than that of the man in the iron mask. The books written on the subject would fill a library. People despaired of ever lifting the veil. The story of the Iron Mask, says Michelet, will probably remain forever obscure, and Henry Martin adds, history has no right to pronounce judgment on what will never leave the domain of conjecture. Today, the doubt no longer exists. The problem is solved. Before disclosing the solution which criticism has unanimously declared correct, we propose to transcribe the scanty authentic documents that we possess on the masked man, and then to state the principal solutions which have been proposed before arriving at the true solution. 1. The documents. The Register of the Bastille. To begin with, let us quote the text which is the origin and foundation of all the works published on the question of the Iron Mask. Etienne du Junca, King's lieutenant at the Bastille, in a journal which he began to keep on October 2, 1690, when he entered upon his office, a sort of register in which he recorded day by day the details concerning the arrival of the prisoners, writes, under date September 18, 1698, these lines which the popular legend has rendered memorable. Thursday, September 18, 1698. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, M. de Saint-Mars, governor of the Château of the Bastille, made his first appearance, coming from his governorship of the Isles of Saint Marguerite Honorat, bringing with him in his conveyance a prisoner he had formerly at Pignerol, whom he caused to be always masked, whose name is not mentioned. Directly he got out of the carriage, he put him in the first room of the Bazinière Tower, waiting till night for me to take him at 9 o'clock, and put him with M. de Rossarges, one of the sergeants brought by the governor, alone in the third room of the Berdière Tower, which I had furnished with all necessaries some days before his arrival, having received orders to that effect from M. de Saint-Mars, the which prisoner will be looked after and waited on by M. de Rossarges, and maintained by the governor. In a second register, supplementary to the first, in which du Junca records details of the liberation or the death of the prisoners, we read, under date November 19, 1703. On the same day, November 19, 1703, the unknown prisoner, always masked with a mask of black velvet, whom M. de Saint-Mars the governor brought with him on coming from the Isles de Saint Marguerite, whom he had kept for a long time, the which happening to be a little ill yesterday on coming from Mass, he died today about 10 o'clock at night without having had a serious illness. It could not have been slighter. M. Giraud, our chaplain, confessed him yesterday, is surprised at his death. He did not receive the sacrament, and our chaplain exhorted him a moment before he died. And this unknown prisoner, kept here for so long, was buried on Tuesday at 4 o'clock p.m. November 20 in the graveyard of St. Paul, our parish. On the register of burial he was given a name also unknown. M. de Rossarges, major and a rail surgeon, signed the register. And in the margin, I have since learnt that they called him M. de Marchial on the register, and that 40 livres was the cost of the funeral. The registers of du Junca were preserved among the ancient archives of the Bastille, whence they passed to the Arsenal Library, where they are now kept. They are drawn up in the clumsy handwriting of a soldier with little skill in penmanship. The spelling is bad, but the facts are stated with precision and have always proved accurate when checked. The extract from the second register shows that the mysterious prisoner wore not a mask of iron but one of black velvet. Further, the entry on the register of St. Paul's Church has been discovered. It reads, on the 19th, Marchiali, aged 45 years or thereabouts, died in the Bastille, whose body was buried in the churchyard of St. Paul, his parish, the 20th of the present month, in the presence of M. Rossage, sick, Major of the Bastille, and of M. Riglhes, sick, Surgeon Major of the Bastille, who signed. Signed, Rossarges Reilhe. Such are the fundamental documents for the story of the Iron Mask. We shall see by and by that they are sufficient to establish the truth. The letter of the governor of Saint Marguerite. We have just seen from the register of Du Junca that the masked man had been at the Isles of Sainte Marguerite under the charge of Saint Mars, who, on being appointed governor of the Bastille, had brought the prisoner with him. In the correspondence exchanged between Saint Mars and the minister Barbazia occurs the following letter, dated January 6, 1696, in which Saint Mars describes his method of dealing with the prisoners, and the masked man is referred to under the appellation "my ancient prisoner." "And why, Lord, you command me to tell you what is the practice when I am absent or ill, as to the visits made and precautions taken daily in regard to the prisoners committed to my charge. My 2 lieutenants serve the meals at the regular hours, just as they have seen me do, and as I still do very often when I am well. The first of my lieutenants, who takes the keys of the prison of my ancient prisoner with whom we commence, opens the 3 doors and enters the chamber of the prisoner, who politely hands him the plates and dishes, put one on top of another, to give them into the hands of the lieutenant, who has only to go through 2 doors to hand them to one of my sergeants, who takes them and places them on a table 2 steps away, where is the second lieutenant, who examines everything that enters and leaves the prison and sees that there is nothing written on the plate, and after they have given him the utensil, they examine his bed inside and out, and then the gratings and windows of his room, and very often the man himself. After having asked him very politely if he wants anything else, they lock the doors and proceed to similar business with the other prisoners." The letter of M. de Palto. On June 19, 1768, M. de Formenoir de Palto addressed from the Château of Palto near Villeneuve-le-Roi to the celebrated Fréron, editor of the Année littéraire, a letter which was inserted in the number for June 30, 1768. The author of this letter was the grandnephew of Saint Mars. At the time when the latter was appointed governor of the Bastille, the Château of Palto belonged to him, and he halted there with his prisoner on the way from the Isles of Sainte Marguerite to Paris. In 1698, writes M. de Palto, M. de Saint Mars passed from the governorship of the Isles of Sainte Marguerite to that of the Bastille. On his way to take up his duties, he stayed with his prisoner on his estate at Palto. The masked man arrived in a conveyance which preceded that of M. de Saint Mars. They were accompanied by several horsemen. The peasants went to meet their lord. M. de Saint Mars ate with his prisoner, who had his back turned to the windows of the dining hall looking on the courtyard. The peasants whom I have questioned could not see whether he ate with his mask on, but they observed very well that M. de Saint Mars, who was opposite him at table, had 2 pistols beside his plate. They had only 1 footman to wait on them, and he fetched the dishes from an anteroom where they were brought him, carefully shutting the door of the dining hall behind him. When the prisoner crossed the courtyard, he always had his black mask over his face. The peasants noticed that his lips and teeth were not covered, that he was tall and had white hair. M. de Saint Mars slept in a bed that was put up for him near that of the masked man. This account is marked throughout with the stamp of truth. M. de Palto, the writer, makes no attempt to draw inferences from it. He declares for none of the hypotheses then under discussion in regard to the identity of the mysterious unknown. He is content to report the testimony of those of his peasants who saw the masked man when he passed through their lord's estates. The only detail in the story which we are able to check, a characteristic detail, it is true, is that of the black mask of which M. de Palto speaks. It corresponds exactly to the mask of black velvet mentioned in Du Junca's register. The Château of Palto is still in existence. In his work on Superintendent Fouquet, M. Jules Lair gives a description of it. The Château of Palto, situated on an eminence among woods and vines, presented at that time, as it does today, the aspect of a great lordly mansion in the style of the time of Henry IV and Louis XIII. First there is a wide courtyard, then 2 wings, within the principal building and the chapel. The lower story is supported on arches, and its lofty windows go right up into the roof and light the place from floor to attic. Since the 18th century, however, the château has undergone some modifications. The room in which Saint Mars dined with his prisoner is now used as a kitchen. The notes of Major Chevalier. In addition to the entries in Du Junca's journal which we have transcribed, scholars are accustomed to invoke, as equally worthy of credence though later in date, the testimony of Father Griffith, chaplain of the Bastille, and that of Major Chevalier. The extracts from Du Junca quoted above were published for the first time in 1769 by Father Griffith, who added the following comments. The memory of the masked prisoner was still preserved among the officers, soldiers, and servants of the Bastille when M. Delaunay, who has long been the governor, came to occupy a place on the staff of the garrison. Those who had seen him with his mask when he crossed the courtyard on his way to attend Mass said that after his death the order was given to burn everything he had used, such as linen, clothes, cushions, counterpanes, and that the very walls of the room he had occupied had to be scraped and whitewashed again, and that all the tiles of the flooring were taken up and replaced by others, because they were so afraid that he had found the means to conceal some notes or some mark, the discovery of which would have revealed his name. The testimony of Father Griffith happens to be confirmed by some notes from the pen of a major of the Bastille named Chevalier. The major was not a personage of the highest rank in the administration of the Bastille, since above him were the governor and the king's lieutenant, but he was the most important personage. The whole internal administration, so far as the prisoners were concerned, was entrusted to him. Chevalier fulfilled these duties for nearly 38 years, from 1749 to 1787. M. Fernand Bournon's estimate of him is as follows. Chevalier is a type of the devoted, hard-working official who has no ambition to rise above a rather subordinate rank. It would be impossible to say how much the administration of the Bastille owed to his zeal and to his perfect familiarity with a service of extraordinary difficulty. Among notes put together with a view to a history of the Bastille, Chevalier gives in condensed form the information furnished by Du Junca's register, and adds, "This is the famous masked man whom no one has ever known. He was treated with great distinction by the governor and was seen only by M. de Rossarges, major of the said château, who had sole charge of him. He was not ill except for a few hours and died rather suddenly, interred at St. Paul on Tuesday, November 20, 1703 at 4:00 p.m. under the name of Marchurgs. He was buried in a new white shroud given by the governor, and practically everything in his room was burnt, such as his bed, chairs, tables, and other bits of furniture, or else melted down, and the whole was thrown into the privies." These notes of Father Griffith and Major Chevalier have derived great force in the eyes of historians from their exact agreement. But a close examination shows that the testimony of Chevalier was the source of Father Griffith's information. In fact, Chevalier was major of the Bastille when the Jesuit compiled his work, and it is doubtless upon his authority that the latter depended. Documents recently published in the Revue Bleu upset these assertions, which appeared to be based on the firmest foundations. In the Journal of Du Junca, which we have already mentioned, we read under date April 30, 1701, Sunday, April 30, about 9:00 in the evening, M. Aumont the Younger came, bringing and handing over to us a prisoner named M. Marinville, alias Ricarville, who was an officer in the army, a malcontent, too free with his tongue, a worthless fellow, whom I received in obedience to the king's orders sent through the Count of Pontchartrain, whom I have had put along with the man Termin in the second room of the Berdidier Tower with the ancient prisoner, both being well locked in. The ancient prisoner here referred to is no other than the masked man. When he entered the Bastille, as we have seen, on September 18, 1698, he was placed in the third room of the Berdidier Tower. In 1701, the Bastille happened to be crowded with prisoners, and they had to put several together in one and the same room, so the man in the mask was placed with two companions. One of them, Jean-Alexandre de Ricardville, also called Marinville, had been denounced as a retailer of ill speech against the state, finding fault with the policy of France and lauding that of foreigners, especially that of the Dutch. The police reports depict him as a beggarly fellow, poorly dressed, and about 60 years old. He had formerly been, as Du Junca says, an officer in the royal troops. Marinville left the Bastille on October 19, 1708. He was transferred to Charenton, where he died in February 1709. It must be pointed out that Charenton was then an open prison, where the prisoners associated with one another and had numerous relations with the outside world. The second of the fellow prisoners of the man in the mask, Dominique François Termont, was a servant. When he was placed in the Bastille on July 30, 1700, he was 19 years old. He was accused of sorcery and of debauching young girls. He was put in the second room of the Bertaudiere Tower, where he was joined by Marinville and the man in the mask. On December 14, 1701, he was transferred to Bicarter. He lost his reason in 1703 and died in 1708. The man in the mask was taken out of the third room of the Bertaudiere Tower, in which he had been placed on his entrance to the Bastille, on March 6, 1701, in order to make room for a woman named Anne Randon, a witch and fortune-teller, who was shut up alone in it. The masked prisoner was then placed in the second Bertaudiere with Termont, who had been there, as we have just seen, since July 30, 1700. Marinville joined them on April 30, 1701. Not long after, the masked man was transferred to another room with or without Marinville. Termont had been taken to Bicarter in 1701. We find that on February 26, 1703, the Abbé Gonzel, a priest of Franche-Comté, accused of being a spy, was shut up alone in the second Bertaudiere. These facts are of undeniable authenticity, and one sees at a glance the consequences springing from them. At the time when the masked prisoner shared the same room with fellow captives, other prisoners at the Bastille were kept rigorously isolated. In spite of the crowded state of the prison, so much more important did the reasons for their incarceration seem. The man in the mask was associated with persons of the lowest class who were soon afterwards to leave and take their places with the ruck of prisoners at Charenton and Bicarter. We read in a report of D'Argenson that there was even some talk of enlisting one of them, Termont, in the army. Such, then, was this strange personage, the repository of a terrible secret of which Madame Palatine was already speaking in mysterious terms, the man who puzzled kings, Louis XVI, who puzzled the very officers of the Bastille and caused them to write stories as remote as possible from the reality. To the legend. If the very officers of the Bastille indulged such wild freaks of imagination, what flights into dreamland might not the thoughts of the public be expected to take? The movement is a very curious one to follow. To begin with, we have the light Venetian mask transforming itself into an iron mask with steel articulations which the prisoner was never without. The consideration, imaginary as we have seen, with which the prisoner is supposed to have been treated, and which is referred to in the notes of Major Chevalier, becomes transformed into marks of a boundless deference shown by the jailers towards their captive. The story was that Saint Mars, the governor, a knight of St. Louis, never spoke to the prisoner except standing with bared head, that he served him at table with his own hands and on silver plate, and that he supplied him with the most luxurious raiment his fancy could devise. Chevalier says that after his death his room at the Bastille was done up like new, to prevent his successor from discovering any telltale evidence in some corner. Speaking of the time when the masked man was at the Isles of Sainte Marguerite, Voltaire relates, "One day the prisoner wrote with a knife on a silver dish, and threw the dish out of the window towards a boat moored on the shore almost at the foot of the tower. A A fisherman to whom the boat belonged picked up the dish and carried it to the governor. Astonished, he asked the fisherman, "Have you read what is written on this dish, and has anyone seen it in your hands?" "I cannot read," replied the fisher. "I have only just found it, and no one has seen it." The poor man was detained until the governor was assured he could not read and that no one had seen the dish. "Go," he said, "it is lucky for you that you can't read." In Father Papin's History of Provence, linen takes the place of the dish. The upshot is more tragic. I found in the Citadel an officer of the Free Company aged 79 years. He told me several times that a barber of that company saw one day under the prisoner's window something white floating on the water. He went and picked it up and carried it to M. de Saint-Mars. It was a shirt of fine linen, folded with no apparent care, and covered with the prisoner's writing. M. de Saint-Mars, after unfolding it and reading a few lines, asked the barber with an air of great embarrassment if he had not had the curiosity to read what was on it. The barber protested over and over again that he had read nothing, but 2 days after he was found dead in his bed. And the fact that Saint-Mars had had the body of the prisoner buried in a white cloth struck the imagination, and was developed in its turn into an extraordinary taste on the part of the prisoner for linen of the finest quality and for costly lace, all which was taken to prove that the masked man was a son of Anne of Austria, who had a very special love, it was declared, for valuable lace and fine linen. A brother of Louis Roman XIV, we are able to fix with precision, we believe, the origin of the legend which made the Iron Mask a brother of Louis XIV. Moreover, it was due to this suggestion, which was hinted at from the first, that the story of the prisoner made so great a noise. The glory of it belongs to the most famous writer of the 18th century. With a boldness of imagination for which today he would be envied by the cleverest journalistic inventor of sensational paragraphs, Voltaire started this monstrous hoax on its vigorous flight. In 1745, there had just appeared a sort of romance entitled Notes Towards the History of Persia, which was attributed not without some reason to Madame de Villemaisons. The book contained a story within a story in which the mysterious prisoner, who was beginning to be talked about everywhere, was identified with the Duc de Vermandois, and to this fact was due the sensation which the book caused. Voltaire immediately saw how he could turn the circumstance to account. He had himself at one time been confined in the Bastille, which was one reason for speaking of it. But he did not dare put in circulation suddenly, without some preparation, the terrible story he had just conceived, and with a very delicate sensitiveness to public opinion, he contented himself with printing the following paragraph in the first edition of his Age of Louis XIV. A few months after the death of Mazarin, there occurred an event which is unexampled in history, and what is not less strange has been passed over in silence by all the historians. There was sent with the utmost secrecy to the Château of the Isle of Sainte Marguerite in the Sea of Provence, an unknown prisoner of more than ordinary height, young, and with features of rare nobility and beauty. On the way, this prisoner wore a mask the chinpiece of which was fitted with springs of steel, which allowed him to eat freely with the mask covering his face. The order had been given to kill him if he uncovered. He remained in the island until an officer in whom great confidence was placed, named Saint-Mars, governor of Pignerol, having been made governor of the Bastille, came to the Isle of Sainte Marguerite to fetch him, and conducted him to the Bastille, always masked. The Marquis de Louvois saw him in the island before his removal and remained standing while he spoke to him, with a consideration savoring of respect. Voltaire, however, does not say who this extraordinary prisoner was. He observed the impression produced on the public by his story. Then he ventured more boldly, and in the first edition of his Questions on the Encyclopedia insinuated that the motive for covering the prisoner's face with a mask was fear lest some too striking likeness should be recognized. He still refrained from giving his name, but already everyone was on tiptoe with the expectation of startling news. At last, in the second edition of Questions on the Encyclopedia, Voltaire intrepidly added that the man in the mask was a uterine brother of Louis XIV, a son of Mazarin and Anne of Austria, and older than the king. We know what incomparable agitators of public opinion the encyclopedists were. Once hatched, the story was not long in producing a numerous progeny which grew in their turn and became a monstrous brood. We read in the memoirs of the Duc de Richelieu, compiled by his secretary the Abbé Solavy, that Mdlle. de Valois, the regent's daughter and at this date the mistress of Richelieu, consented at the instigation of the latter to prostitute herself to her father. Tradition has it that the regent was enamored of his daughter, in order to get sight of an account of the Iron Mask drawn up by Saint Mars. According to this story, which the author of the memoirs prints in its entirety, Louis XIV was born at noon, and at 8:30 in the evening, while the king was at supper, the queen was brought to bed of a second son, who was put out of sight so as to avoid subsequent dissensions in the state. The Baron de Gleichen goes still farther. He is at the pains to prove that it was the true heir to the throne who was put out of sight, to the profit of a child of the queen and the cardinal. Having become masters of the situation at the death of the king, they substituted their son for the dauphin, the substitution being facilitated by a strong likeness between the children. One sees at a glance the consequences of this theory, which nullifies the legitimacy of the last Bourbons. But the career of imagination was not yet to be checked. The legend came into full bloom under the First Empire. Pamphlets then appeared in which the version of Baron de Gleichen was revived. Louis XIV had been only a bastard, the son of foreigners. The lawful heir had been imprisoned at the Isles of Sainte Marguerite, where he had married the daughter of one of his keepers. Of this marriage was born a child who, as soon as he was weaned, was sent to Corsica, and entrusted to a reliable person as a child coming of good stock in Italian Buonaparte. Of that child the emperor was the direct descendant. The right of Napoleon I to the throne of France established by the Iron Mask. There is a discovery which the great Dumas missed, but incredible as it seems, there were men who actually took these fables seriously. In a Vendian manifesto circulated among the Chouans, in Nouveaux of the year IX, we read, "It is not wise for the royalist party to rely on the assurances given by some emissaries of Napoleon that he seized the throne only to restore the Bourbons. Everything proves that he only awaits the general pacification to declare himself, and that he means to base his right on the birth of the children of the Iron Mask. We shall not stay to refute the hypothesis which makes the Iron Mask a brother of Louis XIV. Marius Toppin has already done so in the clearest possible manner. The notion, moreover, has long been abandoned. The last writers who adhered to it date from the Revolutionary period. The successive incarnations of the Iron Mask. Never has an Indian deity, says Paul de Saint Victor speaking of the Iron Mask, undergone so many metempsychoses and so many avatars. It would take too long merely to enumerate all the individuals with whom it has been attempted to identify the Iron Mask. Even women have not escaped. We shall cite rapidly the theories which have found most credence amongst the public, or those which have been defended in the most serious works, in order to arrive finally at the identification. As will be seen, it is one of those proposed long ago, which is beyond doubt the true one. The hypothesis which, after that of a brother of Louis XIV, has most powerfully excited public opinion, is that which made the mysterious unknown Louis, Comte de Vermandois, Admiral of France and son of the charming Louise de la Vallière. This was indeed the belief of Father Griffet, chaplain of the Bastille and even of the officers of the staff. But the conjecture is disproved in a single line. The Comte de Vermandois died at Courtrai on November 18, 1683. A precisely similar fact refutes the theory identifying the Iron Mask with the Duke of Monmouth, the natural son of Charles II, and Lucy Walters. Monmouth perished on the scaffold in 1683. Lagrange Chancel throws much ardor and talent into a defense of the theory which made the Iron Mask Francis of Vendôme, Duc de Beaufort, who under the Fronde was called King of the Markets. The Duc de Beaufort died at the Siege of Candia, June 25, 1669. To Lagrange Chancel succeeds the Chevalier de Tolles. "I have discovered the man in the mask," he cries, "and it is my duty to impart my discovery to Europe and posterity." This discovery brings forward one Avidic, an Armenian patriarch of Constantinople and Jerusalem, kidnapped in the East at the instigation of the Jesuits and transported to France. Vergennes, on entering the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, set investigations on foot. They confirmed the statement that Avidic had actually been arrested in the circumstances indicated, but after 1706, and so he could not be identified with the Iron Mask. Such were the theories of the 18th century. We come now to those of our own time. Since mystery and sinister machinations were involved, the Jesuits could not be long left out of the business. We have just seen them at their tricks with the Armenian patriarch. People dreamt of an innocent youth thrown into a dungeon at their instigation for having written a couple of verses against them. But even this fancy was completely cast into the shade in a work published in 1885 under the pseudonym of Ubalda, the author of which was unquestionably M. Anatole Loquin. This is his conclusion: "The more I reflect, the more I believe I recognize in the man in the Iron Mask, without any elaborate theory, without prejudice on my part, no other than J.B. Poquelin de Molière. The Jesuits have got their revenge for Tartuffe." Let us come now to the conjectures which have almost hit the truth and have been defended by genuine scholars. Superintendent Fouquet is the solution of the bibliophile Jacob Paul Lacroix. M. Lair has shown that Fouquet died at Pignerol of a sort of apoplexy on March 23, 1680, at the very moment when there was an idea at court of sending him to the waters at Bourbon, as a first step towards his final liberation. François Ravaisin, the learned and charming keeper of the Arsenal Library, whose work in classifying the archives of the Bastille we have had the honor to continue, believed for a moment that the celebrated prisoner might have been the young Count de Kerwals who had fought at Candia under the orders of Admiral de Beaufort. Ravaisin put forth his theory with much hesitation, and as in the sequel he was himself led to abandon it, we need not dwell any longer upon it. M. Loiseleur, in the course of his brilliant controversy with Marius Topin, suggested an obscure spy arrested by Catinat in 1681, and his opponent refuted him in the most piquant manner by discovering Catinat in the very prisoner he was said to have arrested. General Jung published a large volume in support of the claims of a Sir Oldendorf, a native of Lorraine, a spy and poisoner arrested on March 29, 1673 in a trap laid for him at one of the passages of the Somme. The theory was refuted by M. Loiseleur. As M. Lair pointed out, General Jung did not even succeed in proving that his nominee entered Pignerol, an essential condition to his being the man in the mask. Baron Carrutti urged the claims of a mad Jacobin, a prisoner at Pignerol whose name remains unknown. But this Jacobin died at Pignerol towards the close of 1693. The recent work of M. Émile Bergaud, written in collaboration with Commandant Bézeries, made a great sensation. He fixes on General Vivien l'Abbé de Bioland, whom Louvois arrested for having shown dereliction of a general's duty before Coney. M. Geoffrey de Grandmaison published in the Univers of January 9, 1895, 2 receipts signed by General de Bioland, one in 1699, when the masked man was in rigorous isolation at the Bastille, the other in 1705, when he had been dead for 2 years. We come at last to the hypothesis which is the most probable of all, after the true hypothesis, of course. Eustache Dodger, whom M. Lair identifies with the masked prisoner, was a valet, who had been put into jail at Pignerol on July 28, 1669. But it must be noted that the masked prisoner was kept guarded in rigorous secrecy in the early days of his detention, as long as he was at Pignerol and the Isles of Sainte Marguerite. Now when Dodger went to Pignerol, his case seemed of such slight importance that St. Mars thought of making him into a servant for the other prisoners. And in fact, in 1675, Louvois gave him as a valet to Fouquet, who for some time past had seen the rigor of his confinement sensibly mitigated, receiving visits, walking freely in the courts and purlieus of the fortress, Dodger accompanying him. Further, we know that the masked man was transferred direct from Pignerol to the Isles of Sainte Marguerite, whilst Dodger was transferred in 1681 to Exiles, whence he only went to the Isles in 1687. We now come to the correct solution. 3. Emetitioli. To Baron Heiss, once captain in the Alsace regiment and one of the most distinguished bibliophiles of his time, belongs the honor of being the first, in a letter dated from Phalsbourg, June 28, 1770, and published by the journal Encyclopédique, to identify the masked prisoner with Count Mattioli, Secretary of State to the Duke of Mantua. After him, Dutens in 1783 in his intercepted correspondence, Baron de Chambrier in 1795 in a memoir presented to the Academy of Berlin, Rufazilak, member of the Legislative Assembly and the Convention, in a remarkable work printed in 1801. Then successively, Reth, Delort, Ellis, Carlo Botta, Armand Baschet, Marius Toppin, Paul de Saint-Victor, and M. Gallion, in a series of publications more or less important, endeavored to prove that the man in the mask was the Duke of Mantua's Secretary of State. The scholars most intimate with the history of Louis XIV's government, Depping, Cherul, Camille Rousset, have not hesitated to pronounce in favor of the same view. While against them single-handed like his D'Artagnan, Alexandre Dumas resisted the efforts of 20 scholars and the Vicomte de Bragelonne, giving a new lease of life to the legend about the brother of Louis XIV, put in circulation by Voltaire and reinforced by the Revolution, drove back into their dust among the archives the documents which students had exhumed. We have no longer to deal with so formidable an adversary, and we hope that the following pages will not leave the shadow of a doubt. We know how, under the influence of Louvois, the able and insinuating policy directed first by Mazarin, then by Lyon, gave way to a military diplomacy blunt and aggressive. Louis XIV was master of Pignerol, acquired in 1632. He was induced by Louvois to cast covetous glances at Cazel. In possession of these two places, the French armies could not but dominate Upper Italy, and hold the court of Turin directly at their mercy. The throne of Mantua was then occupied by a young duke, Charles IV of Gonzago, frivolous, happy-go-lucky, dissipating his wealth at Venice in fêtes and pleasures. In 1677 he had pledged to the Jews the crown revenues for several years. Charles IV was also Marquis of Montferrat, of which Cazel was the capital. Noting with watchful eye the frivolity and financial straits of the young prince, the court of Versailles conceived the bold scheme of buying Cazel for hard cash. At this date, one of the principal personages in Mantua was Count Hercules Antony Mattioli. He was born at Bologna on December 1, 1640, of a distinguished family. A brilliant student, he had barely passed his 20th year when he was elected a professor at the University of Bologna. Afterwards he established himself at Mantua, where Charles III, whose confidence he had won, made him his Secretary of State. Charles IV, continuing the favor of his father, not only maintained Mattioli in his office as Minister of State, but appointed him an honorary senator, a dignity which was enhanced by the title of Count. Louis XIV was employing at the capital of the Venetian Republic a keen-witted and enterprising ambassador, the Abbé d'Estrades. He saw through the ambitious and intriguing nature of Mattioli, and towards the end of 1677 succeeded in winning over his support for the designs of the French court on Cazel. On January 12, 1678, Louis XIV, with his own hand, wrote expressing his thanks to Mattioli, who by and by came to Paris. On December 8 the contract was signed, the Duke of Mantua receiving in exchange for Cazel 100,000 crowns. In a private audience, Louis XIV presented Mattioli with a costly diamond and paid him the sum of 100 double louis. Scarcely 2 months after Mattioli's journey to France, the courts of Vienna, Madrid, Turin, and the Venetian Republic were simultaneously informed of all that had taken place. In order to reap a double harvest of gold, Mattioli had cynically betrayed both his master Charles IV and the King of France. Like a thunderbolt there came to Versailles the news of the arrest of Baron Disfeld, the envoy appointed by Louis XIV, to exchange ratifications with Mattioli. The governor of Milan had caused him to be seized and handed over to the Spaniards. The rage of Louis XIV, and of Louvois, who had urged the opening of negotiations, taken an active part in them, and begun preparations for the occupation of Kassel, may well be imagined. The Abbé d'Estrades, not less irritated, conceived a scheme of the most daring kind, proposing to Versailles nothing less than the abduction of the Mantuan minister. But Louis XIV was determined to have no scandal. Catinat was charged with carrying out the scheme in person. The Abbé d'Estrades, in his dealings with Mattioli, feigned ignorance of the double game the Count was playing. He led him to believe, on the contrary, that the balance of the sums promised at Versailles was about to be paid. A meeting was fixed for May 2, 1679. On that day d'Estrades and Mattioli got into a carriage, the passing of which was awaited by Catinat, accompanied by some dozen men. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Mattioli was in the fortress of Pignerol in the hands of jailer Saint Mars. When we remember the rank held by the Italian minister, we are confronted with one of the most audacious violations of international law of which history has preserved a record. Early in the year 1694, Mattioli was transferred to the Isles of Sainte Marguerite. We have seen that he entered the Bastille on September 18, 1698, and died there on November 19, 1703. The details that we possess of the imprisonment of Mattioli at Pignerol and afterwards at the Isles of Sainte Marguerite show that he was at the outset treated with the consideration due to his rank and to the position he occupied at the time of his arrest. Eventually, the respect which the prisoner had at first inspired gradually diminished. As years went on, the attention shown him grew less and less until the day when, at the Bastille, he was given a room in common with persons of the basest class. On the other hand, the rigor of his confinement, so far as the secrecy in which he was kept was concerned, was more and more relaxed. What it was material to conceal was the circumstances under which Mattioli had been arrested, and with the lapse of time this secret continually diminished in importance. As to the mask of black velvet which Mattioli had among his possessions when he was arrested, and which he put on, without a doubt, only for the occasion, this in reality constituted a relief to his captivity, for it permitted the prisoner to leave his room while the other state prisoners were rigorously mewed up in theirs. It remains to prove that the masked prisoner was really Mattioli. 1. In the dispatch sent by Louis XIV to the Abbé d'Estrades 5 days before the arrest, the king approves the scheme of his ambassador and authorizes him to secure Mattioli, since you believe you can get him carried off without the affair giving rise to any scandal. The prisoner is to be conducted to Pignerol, where instructions are being sent to receive him and keep him there without anybody having knowledge of it. The king's orders close with these words, "You must see to it that no one knows what becomes of this man." The capture effected, Catinat wrote on his part to Louvois, "It came off without any violence, and no one knows the name of the knave, not even the officers who helped to arrest him." Finally, we have a very curious pamphlet entitled La Prudenza Triomphante di Kassel, written in 1682, that is, little more than 2 years after the event, and this slight detail is of capital importance, 30 years before there was any talk of the man in the mask. In this we read, "The secretary Mattioli was surrounded by 10 or 12 horsemen who seized him, disguised him, masked him, and conducted him to Pignerol. A fact, moreover, confirmed by a tradition which in the 18th century was still rife in the district where scholars succeeded in culling it. Is there any need to insist on the strength of the proofs afforded by these three documents, taken in connection one with another? 2. We know from Du Junca's register that the masked man was shut up at Pignerol under the charge of St. Mars. In 1681, St. Mars gave up the governorship of Pignerol for that of exiles. We can determine with absolute precision the number of prisoners St. Mars had then in his keeping. It was exactly 5. A dispatch from Louvois, dated June 9, is very clear. In the first paragraph, he orders the 2 prisoners in the lower tower to be removed. In the second, he adds, "The rest of the prisoners in your charge." Here there is a clear indication of the rest. What follows settles the number. The Sieur du Chamy has orders to pay 2 crowns a day for the board of these 3 prisoners. This account, as clear as arithmetic can make it, is further confirmed by the letter addressed by St. Mars to the Abbé d'Estrades on June 25, 1681, when he was setting out for exiles. "I received yesterday the warrant appointing me governor of exiles. I am to keep charge of 2 jailbirds I have here, who have no other name than the gentleman of the lower tower. Mattioli will remain here with 2 other prisoners." The prisoners then were 5 in number, and the masked man is to be found of necessity among them. Now we know who these 5 were. 1, a certain La Rivière, who died at the end of December 1686. 2, a Jacobin out of his mind, who died at the end of 1693. 3, a certain Dubruel, who died at the Isles of St. Marguerite about 1697. There remain Dodger and Mattioli. The man in the mask is, without possible dispute, the one or the other. We have explained above the reasons which lead us to discard Dodger. The mysterious prisoner, then, was Mattioli. The proof is mathematically exact. Burial certificate of the masked prisoner, November 20, 1703, reproduced from the facsimile in the 6th edition of The Man in the Iron Mask by Marius Toppin, 1883. The original in the City Archives of Paris was destroyed in the conflagration of 1871. 3. Opposite this page will be found a facsimile reproduction of the death certificate of the masked prisoner as inscribed on the registers of the Church of St. Paul. It is the very name of the Duke of Mantua's former secretary that is traced there, Marchiali. It must be remembered that Marchiali would be pronounced in Italian Marchiali, and that St. Mars, governor of the Bastille, who furnished the information on which the certificate was drawn up, almost always wrote in his correspondence, a characteristic detail, not Mattioli, but Martiali. That is the very name on the register, less distorted than the name of the major of the Bastille, who was called Rossarges and not Rossage, as given on the register. And the name of the surgeon, who was called Rielch and not Riglhe. It has been shown above how, as time went on, the rigorous seclusion to which the masked prisoner had been condemned was relaxed. What it had been thought necessary to conceal was the manner in which Mattioli had been captured, and with time that secret itself had lost its importance. As the Duke of Mantua had declared himself very well pleased with the arrest of the minister by whom he, no less than Louis XIV, had been deceived, there was nothing to prevent the name from being inscribed on a register of death, where, moreover, no one would ever have thought of looking for it. Let us add that, in consequence of error or carelessness on the part of the officer who supplied the information for the register, or perhaps on the part of the parson or beadle who wrote it, the age is stated incorrectly, 45 years or thereabouts, while Mattioli was 63 when he died. However, the register was filled up without the least care as a formality of no importance. 4. The Duc de Choiseul pressed Louis XV to reveal to him the clue to the enigma. The king escaped with an evasion. One day, however, he said to him, "If you knew all about it, you would see that it has very little interest." And some time after, when Madame de Pompadour, at de Choiseul's instigation, pressed the king on the subject, he told her that the prisoner was the minister of an Italian prince. In the memoirs of the private life of Marie Antoinette by her principal lady-in-waiting, Madame de Campan, we read that the queen tormented Louis XVI, who did not know the secret, to have a search made among the papers of the various ministries. "I was with the queen," says Madame de Campan, "when the king, having finished his researches, told her that he had found nothing in the secret papers which had any bearing on the existence of this prisoner. That he had spoken on the subject to M. de Maurepas, whose age brought him nearer the time when the whole story must have been known to the ministers. Maurepas had been minister of the king's household as a very young man in the early years of the 18th century, having the department of the letters de cachet, and that M. de Maurepas had assured him that the prisoner was simply a man of a very dangerous character through his intriguing spirit, and a subject of the Duke of Mantua. He was lured to the frontier, arrested, and kept a prisoner, at first at Pignerol, then at the Bastille. These two pieces of evidence are of such weight that they alone would be sufficient to fix the truth. When they were written, there was no talk of Mattioli, of whose very name Madame de Campan was ignorant. Supposing that Madame de Campan had amused herself by inventing a fable, an absurd and improbable supposition, for what reason could she have had for so doing? It is impossible to admit that her imagination could have hit upon fancies so absolutely in accord with facts. And so the problem is solved. The legend which had reared itself even as high as the throne of France topples down. The satisfaction of the historian springs from his reflection that all serious historical works for more than a century, resting on far-reaching researches and eschewing all preoccupations foreign to science, such, for example, as the desire of attaining a result different from the solutions proposed by one's predecessors, have arrived at the same conclusion which proves to be the correct solution. Heiss, Baron de Chambrier, Reth, Rufazelac, Delort, Carlo Botta, Armand Baschet, Marius Toppin, Paul de Saint-Victor, Camille Rousset, Cheryl Depping have not hesitated to place under the famous mask of black velvet the features of Mattioli. But at each new effort made by science, legend throws itself once more into the fray, gaining new activity from the passions produced by the revolution. The truth in history sometimes suggests to our mind's eye those white or yellow flowers which float on the water among broad flat leaves. A breeze springs up, a wave rises and submerges them, they disappear, but only for a moment, then they come to the surface again. Chapter V. Men of Letters in the Bastille. Speaking of men of letters in France under the ancient regime, Michelet calls them the martyrs of thought. He adds, "The world thinks France speaks, and that is precisely why the Bastille of France, the Bastille of Paris, I would rather say the prison house of thought, was among all Bastilles execrable, infamous, and accursed." In the course of the article devoted to the Bastille in the Grand Encyclopédie, M. Fernand Bournon writes, after Louis XIV. And throughout the 18th century, the Bastille was especially employed to repress, though it could not stifle, that generous and majestic movement, the glory of the human spirit, towards ideas of emancipation and enfranchisement. It was the epoch when philosophers, publicists, pamphleteers, the very booksellers, were imprisoned there in large numbers. And to substantiate this eloquent apostrophe, M. Bournon cites the names of Voltaire, La Beaumelle, the Abbé Morlet, Marmontel, and Linct, imprisoned in the Bastille, and of Diderot and the Marquis de Murgebau placed in the Château of Vincennes. Let us recall the story of these poor victims in turn, and trace the history of their martyrdom. Voltaire. The most illustrious and the earliest in date of the writers mentioned by M. Bournon is Voltaire. He was sent to the Bastille on two different occasions. His first imprisonment began on May 17, 1717. At that date the poet was only 22 years of age and of no reputation. He did not even bear the name of Voltaire, which he only took after his discharge from the Bastille on April 14, 1718. The cause of his detention was not, the generous and majestic movement towards ideas of enfranchisement which is the glory of the human spirit. But some scurrilities which, to speak plainly, brought him what he deserved. Coarse verses against the regent and his daughter, and public utterances coarser still. Many authors state that Voltaire was imprisoned for writing the Je vous, a satire against the government of Louis XIV, each stanza of which ended with the line, Je vous ces mots, et je n'ai pas 20 ans. This is a mistake. Voltaire was imprisoned for having written the Puro Regnant, some verses on the regent and his daughter, the Duchess of Berry, which it would be impossible to translate. To these he added observations whose reproduction would be equally impossible. At the Bastille, Voltaire underwent examinations in the usual way, in the course of which he lied with impudence. After that he was allowed considerable liberty. It was at the Bastille, wrote Condorcet, that the young poet made the first draft of his poem La Ligue, corrected his tragedy of Oedipe, and composed some very lively lines on the ill luck of being there. When Voltaire was set at liberty, the regent, whom, as we have just said, he had reviled, made him a very handsome offer of his protection. The poet's reply is well known. My lord, I thank your royal highness for being so good as to continue to charge yourself with my board, but I beseech you no longer to charge yourself with my lodging. The young writer thus obtained from the regent a pension of 400 crowns, which later on the latter augmented to 2,000 livres. Voltaire was sent to the Bastille a second time in April 1726. For this new detention there was no justification whatever. He had had a violent quarrel one evening at the opera with the Chevalier de Rohan Chabot. On another occasion at the Comédie Française, the poet and the nobleman had a warm altercation in the box of M. Deal. Lecouvre. Rohan raised his stick, Voltaire put his hand on his sword, and the actress fainted. Some days later, the gallant Chevalier, assisted by half a dozen ruffians behind whom he courageously posted himself, gave our poet a thrashing in broad daylight. When relating the adventure later, the Chevalier said pleasantly, I commanded the squad. From that moment Voltaire sought his revenge. The police reports reveal curious details of the loose, erratic, and feverish life he lived between the insult and his arrest, writes the careful biographer of Voltaire, Dis Noirsteres. From one of these police reports we see that the young writer established relations with soldiers of the guard. Several notorious bullies were constantly about him. A relative who attempted to calm him found him more irritated and violent in his language than ever. It appears certain that he was meditating some act of violence, which indeed would not have been without justification. But the Cardinal de Rohan contrived that he should be arrested on the night of April 17, 1726, and placed in the Bastille. Speaking of this new imprisonment, Marshal de Villars writes, the public, disposed to find fault all round, came to the conclusion on this occasion that everybody was in the wrong. Voltaire for having offended the Chevalier de Rohan, the latter for having dared to commit a capital offense in causing a citizen to be beaten, the government for not having punished a notorious crime, and for having sent the injured party to the Bastille to pacify the injurer. Nevertheless, we read in the report of Hérault, the lieutenant of police, the Sieur de Voltaire was found armed with pocket pistols, and his family, when informed of the matter, unanimously and universally applauded the wisdom of an order which saves this young man the ill effects of some new piece of folly, and the worthy people who compose his family the vexation of sharing his shame. Voltaire remained at the Bastille for 12 days. He was permitted to have a servant of his own choice to wait on him, who was boarded at the king's expense. As for himself, he took his meals whenever he pleased at the governor's table, going out of the Bastille as the governor's residence stood outside the prison. Relatives and friends came to see him. His friend Thiriet dined with him. He was given pens, paper, books, whatever he desired in order to divert himself. Using and abusing these opportunities, writes Dis Noirsteres, Voltaire believed that he could give audience to all Paris. He wrote to those of his friends who had not yet shown a sense of their duty, exhorting them to give him proof they were alive. I have been accustomed to all misfortunes, he wrote to Thiriet, but not yet to that of being utterly abandoned by you. Madame de Bernières, Madame du Dauphin, the Chevalier des Allures really ought to come and see me. They only have to ask permission of M. Hérault or M. de Maurepas. At the time of the poet's entrance to the Bastille, the lieutenant of police had written to the governor, "The Sieur de Voltaire is of a genius that requires humoring. His Serene Highness has approved of my writing to tell you that the king's intention is that you should secure for him mild treatment and the internal liberty of the Bastille, so far as these do not jeopardize the security of his detention." The warrant setting him at liberty was signed on April 26. LABUMLLE. In M. Bournon's list, La Beaumelle comes second. The circumstances under which he was put into the Bastille were as follows. After having fallen out at Berlin with Voltaire, whom he had compared to a monkey, La Beaumelle returned to Paris, whence he had been exiled. There he got printed a new edition of Voltaire's Age of Louis XIV, unknown to the author, and interpolated therein odes insulting to the House of Orleans. "La Beaumelle," exclaimed Voltaire, "is the first who dared to print another man's work in his lifetime. This miserable Erostrates of the Age of Louis XIV has discovered the secret of changing into an infamous libel for 15 ducats, a work undertaken for the glory of the nation." La Beaumelle became an inmate of the Bastille in April 1753 and remained there for 6 months. Writing on May 18, 1753, to M. Roques, Voltaire said that there was scarcely any country where he would not inevitably have been punished sooner or later, and I know from a certain source that there are 2 courts where they would have inflicted a chastisement more signal than that which he is undergoing here. It was not long before La Beaumelle issued his edition of notes towards the history of Madame de Maintenon and that of the past century, with 9 volumes of correspondence. He had fabricated letters which he attributed to Madame de Saint-Guérin and Madame de Frontenac, and published a correspondence of Madame de Maintenon which M. Geoffroy, in a work recognized as authoritative, regards as full of barefaced falsehoods and foul and scurrilous inventions. He had inserted in his work the following phrase: "The court of Vienna has been long accused of having poisoners always in its pay." It must be observed that La Beaumelle's publication owed its great vogue to special circumstances. The author's reputation abroad, the very title of the book, lent it great importance, and France, then engaged in the 7 Years' War, found it necessary to keep in Austria's good graces. La Beaumelle was conveyed to the Bastille a second time. The lieutenant of police, Barrier, put him through the usual examination. La Beaumelle was a man of the world, so witty that in the course of their quarrels he drove Voltaire himself to despair. He showed himself such in his examination. "La Beaumelle," said Barrier to him, "this is what you are giving me when what I ask of you is plain sense." On his expressing a wish for a companion, he was placed with the Abbé d'Estrades. The officers of the Shadow had all his manuscripts brought from his house, so that he might continue his literary work. He had at the Bastille a library of 600 volumes, ranged on shelves which the governor ordered to be made for him. He there finished a translation of the Annals of Tacitus and the Odes of Horace. He had permission to write to his relatives and friends and to receive visits from them. He had the liberty of walking in the castle garden, of breeding birds in his room, and of having brought from outside all the luxuries to which he was partial. The principal secretary of the lieutenant of police, Duval, reports the following incident. Danry, the famous Ladude, and Alleger, his companion in confinement and ere long in escape, found means to open a correspondence with all the prisoners in the Bastille. They lifted a stone in a closet of the chapel and put their letters underneath it. La Beaumelle pretended to be a woman in his letters to Alleger, and as he was a man of parts and Alleger was of keen sensibility and an excellent writer, the latter fell madly in love with La Beaumelle, to such a degree that, though they mutually agreed to burn their letters, Alleger preserved those of his fancied mistress which he had not the heart to give to the flames, with the result that, the letters being discovered at an inspection of his room, he was put in the cells for some time. The prisoner amused himself also by composing verses which he recited at the top of his voice. This gave much concern to the officers of the garrison, and Chevalier the Major wrote to the lieutenant of police on the matter. "The Sieur de la Beaumelle seems to have gone clean out of his mind. He seems to be a maniac. He amuses himself by declaiming verses in his room for a part of the day. for the rest of the time he is quiet. This second detention lasted from August 1756 till August 1757. The Abbé Morlet. We come to the Abbé Morlet, a man of fine and fascinating mind, one of the best of the encyclopedists who died in 1819, a member of the Institute and the object of general esteem. He was arrested on June 11, 1760 for having had printed and distributed without privilege or permission a pamphlet entitled Preface to the Philosopher's Comedy, or The Vision of Charles Palissot. These are the terms in which later on, Morlet himself judged his pamphlet. I must here make my confession. In this work I went far beyond the limits of a literary pleasantry regarding the seer Palissot, and today I am not without remorse for my fault. And further, as J.J. Rousseau, in whose favor the pamphlet had been in part composed, had to acknowledge, the Abbé very impudently insulted a young and pretty woman, Madame de Robic, who was dying of decline, spitting blood, and did actually die a few days later. The arrest of Morlet was demanded by Malesherbes, then censor of the press, one of the most generous and liberal spirits of the time, the inspirer of the famous remonstrances of the Court of Taxation against letters de cachet, the man who, as M. H. Monin testifies, being elected censor of the press, protected philosophers and men of letters, and by his personal efforts facilitated the publication of the encyclopedia. Speaking of the preface to the comedy, Malesherbes writes to Gabriel de Sartine, Lieutenant General of Police, "It is an outrageous pamphlet, not only against Palissot, but against respectable persons whose very condition should shelter them against such insults. I beg you, sir, to be good enough to put a stop to this scandal. I believe it to be a matter of public importance that the punishment should be very severe, and that this punishment should not stop at the Bastille or the Forel-Evêque, because a very wide distinction must be drawn between the delinquencies of men of letters tearing each other to pieces and the insolence of those who attack persons of the highest consideration in the state. I do not think that Bicaire would be too severe for these last. If you have to ask M. de Saint Florentin for the royal authority for your proceedings, I hope you will be good enough to inform him of the request I am making." It will be observed that on Malesherbes' showing, the Bastille would not suffice to punish the preface to the comedy, nor even the Forel-Evêque. He asks for the most stringent of the prisons by Bicaire. Before long, it is true, this excellent man returned to milder sentiments. An imprisonment at Bicaire, he wrote, would be infamous. Saint Florentin and Sartine were not hard to convince. Morlet was taken to the Bastille. "The warrant for his arrest," wrote one of his agents to Malesherbes, "was executed this morning by Inspector de Hamery with all the amenities possible in so unpleasant a business. De Hamery knows the Abbé Morlet and has spoken of him to M. de Sartine in the most favorable terms." When he entered the Bastille, the Abbé calculated that his imprisonment would last 6 months, and after acknowledging that he at that time viewed his detention without great distress, he adds, "I am bound to say, to lower the too high opinion that may be formed of me and my courage, that I was marvelously sustained by a thought which rendered my little virtue more easy. I saw some literary glory illumining the walls of my prison. Persecuted, I must be better known. The men of letters whom I had avenged and the philosophy for which I was a martyr would lay the foundation of my reputation. The men of the world who love satire would receive me better than ever. A career was opening before me, and I should be able to pursue it at greater advantage. These 6 months at the Bastille would be an excellent recommendation and would infallibly make my fortune." The Abbé remained at the Bastille not 6 months but 6 weeks, which slipped away, he observes. I chuckle still as I think of them, very pleasantly for me. He spent his time in reading romances and with admirable humor in writing a treatise on the liberty of the press. Afterwards the good Abbé informs us that the hopes which he had indulged were not deceived. On issuing from the Bastille he was a made man. Little known 2 months before, he now met everywhere with the reception he desired. The doors of the salons of Madame de Boufflers, Madame Necker, the Baron de Halbach flew open before him. Women pitied him and admired him, and men followed their example. Why have we not today a Bastille to facilitate the career of writers of talent? Emermontiel. To Marmontel, his stay at the royal prison appeared as pleasant as the Abbé Morlet had found his. He had amused himself by reciting at Madame Geoffrin's a mordant satire in which the Duc d'Aumont, first groom of the stole to the king, was cruelly hit. The Duke expostulated. Marmontel wrote to him declaring that he was not the author of the satire, but the nobleman stood his ground. "I am helpless," said the Count de Saint Florentin, who countersigned the letter de cachet to Marmontel. "The Duc d'Aumont accuses you and is determined to have you punished. It is a satisfaction he demands in recompense for his services and the services of his ancestors. The king has been pleased to grant him his wish. So you will go and find M. de Sartine. I am addressing to him the king's order. You will tell him that it was from my hand you received it." "I went to find M. de Sartine," writes Marmontel, "and I found with him the police officer who was to accompany me. M. de Sartine was intending that he should go to the Bastille in a separate carriage, but I myself declined this obliging offer, and we arrived at the Bastille, my introducer and myself, in the same hack. The governor, M. de Beatty, asked me if I wished my servant to be left with me. They made a cursory inspection of my packets and books, and then sent me up to a large room furnished with 2 beds, 2 tables, a low cupboard, and 3 cane chairs. It was cold, but a jailer made us a good fire and brought me wood in abundance. At the same time they gave me pens, ink, and paper, on condition of my accounting for the use I made of them and the number of sheets they allowed me. The jailer came back to ask if I was satisfied with my bed. After examining it, I replied that the mattresses were bad and the coverlets dirty. In a minute all was changed. They sent to ask me what was my dinner hour. I replied, the same as everybody. The Bastille had a library. The governor sent me the catalogue, giving me free choice among the books. I merely thanked him for myself, but my servant asked for the romances of Prévost, and they were brought to him. Let us go on with Marmontel's story. For my part, he says, I had the means of escape from ennui. Having been for a long time impatient of the contempt shown by men of letters for Lucan's poem, which they had not read, and only knew in the barbarous fustian of Brébeuf's version, I had resolved to translate it more becomingly and faithfully into prose. And this work, which would occupy me without fatiguing my brain, was the best possible employment for the solitary leisure of my prison. So I had brought the Pharsalia with me, and to understand it the better, I had been careful to bring with it the commentaries of Caesar. Behold me then at the corner of a good fire, pondering the quarrel of Caesar and Pompey, and forgetting my own with the Duc d'Aumont. And there was Barry too, Marmontel's servant, as philosophical as myself, amusing himself by making our beds placed at 2 opposite corners of my room, which was at this moment lit up by the beams of a fine winter sun, in spite of the bars of 2 strong iron gratings which permitted me a view of the suburb Saint-Anne. 2 hours later, the noise of the bolts of the 2 doors which shut me and startled me from my profound musings, and the 2 jailers, loaded with a dinner I believed to be mine, came in and served it in silence. One put down in front of the fire 3 little dishes covered with plates of common earthenware. The other laid on that one of the 2 tables, which was clear, a tablecloth rather coarse indeed, but white. I saw him place on the table a very fair set of things, a pewter spoon and fork, good household bread, and a bottle of wine. Their duty done, the jailers retired, and the 2 doors were shut again with the same noise of locks and bolts. Then Barry invited me to take my place and served my soup. It was a Friday. The soup made without meat was a puree of white beans with the freshest butter, and a dish of the same beans was the first that Barry served me with. I found all this excellent. The dish of cod he gave me for second course was better still. It was served with a dash of garlic, which gave it a delicacy of taste and odor which would have flattered the taste of the daintiest Gascon. The wine was not first-rate but passable, no sweets. Of course one must expect to be deprived of something. On the whole, I thought that dinner in prison was not half bad. As I was rising from table and Barry was about to sit down, for there was enough for his dinner in what was left, lo and behold, in came my two jailers again with pyramids of dishes in their hands. At this display of fine linen, fine chinaware, spoon and fork of silver, we recognized our mistake, but we made not the ghost of a sign, and when our jailers, having laid down their burden, had retired, "Sir," said Barry, "you have just eaten my dinner, you will quite agree to my having my turn in eating yours." "That's fair," I replied, and the walls of my room were astonished, I fancy, at the sound of laughter. This dinner was not vegetarian. Here are the details. An excellent soup, a juicy beefsteak, a boiled capon's leg streaming with gravy and melting in one's mouth, a little dish of artichokes fried in pickle, a dish of spinach, a very fine William pear, fresh-cut grapes, a bottle of old Burgundy, and best mocha coffee. This was Barry's dinner, with the exception of the coffee and the fruit, which he insisted on reserving for me. After dinner, the governor came to see me and asked me if I found the fare sufficient, assuring me that I should be served from his table, that he would take care to cut my portions himself, and that no one should touch my food but himself. He suggested a fowl for my supper. I thanked him and told him that what was left of the fruit from my dinner would suffice. The reader has just seen what my ordinary fare was at the Bastille, and from this he may infer with what mildness, or rather reluctance, they brought themselves to visit on me the wrath of the Duc d'Aumont. Every day I had a visit from the governor. As he had some smack of literature and even of Latin, he took some interest in following my work, in fact, enjoyed it. But soon, tearing himself away from these little dissipations, he said, "Adieu, I am going to console men who are more unfortunate than you." Such was the imprisonment of Marmontel. It lasted for 11 days. L'Ingenuité. Linked advocate and journalist was arrested for a breach of the press laws and for slander. He was a man of considerable ability but little character. Attorney General Kruppy has devoted to the story of Linked a work as extensive as it is eloquent. He has a wealth of indulgence for his hero. Yet, despite the goodwill he shows for him and endeavors to impart to the reader, his book reveals between the lines that Linked was worthy of little esteem, and that his professional brethren were justified in removing his name from the roll of the advocates of Paris. Linked's captivity lasted for 2 years. He has left a description of it in his memoirs on the Bastille, which made a great noise, and of which the success has endured down to our own day. His book, like everything which came from his pen, is written in a fluent style with spirit and brilliance. The facts cited are for the most part correct, but the author, aiming at making a sensation, has cleverly presented them in a light which distorts their real character. "There are means," says Madame de Staël, "of so distributing light and shade on the facts one is exhibiting as to alter their appearance without altering the groundwork. Take, for instance, the description that Link gives of his belongings while in the Bastille: 2 worm-eat mattresses, a cane chair the seat of which was only held to it by strings, a folding table, a jug for water, 2 earthenware pots, one of them for drinking, and 2 stone slabs to make a fire on." A contemporary could say of Link's memoirs, "It is the longest lie that ever was printed." And yet, if we take the facts themselves, which are related by the clever journalist, and disengage them from the deceitful mirage in which he has enwrapped them, we do not see that his life in the Bastille was so wretched as he endeavors to make us believe. He is forced to acknowledge that his food was always most abundant, adding it is true that was because they wished to poison him. He owed his life, he is convinced, only to the obstinate tenacity of his constitution. He marked, nevertheless, on the menu for the day, which was sent up every morning by the Bastille cook, the dishes he fancied, and later on he had his room furnished after his own heart. He still enjoyed, moreover, enough liberty to write during his imprisonment a work entitled The Trials of 3 Kings, Louis XVI, Charles III, and George III, which appeared in London in 1781. Let us recall once more the famous saying of Linked to the wig-maker of the Bastille on the first day that he presented himself to trim the prisoner's beard: "To whom have I the honor of speaking? I am, sir, the barber to the Bastille. Gad, then, why don't you raise it? In June 1792, some years after his liberation, Link was prosecuted a second time for breach of the press laws. The Revolutionary Tribunal condemned him to death. As he mounted the steps of the scaffold, the ardent pamphleteer thought, mayhap with bitterly ironical regret, of that Bastille whose destruction he had so clamorously demanded.